My wealthy grandfather raised me when my parents left me alone at the airport at age 11. 19 years later, my mother showed up at his will, reading expecting millions until I shut her down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The mahogany doors of Holloway and Associates towered at the end of the penthouse corridor, looking as imposing as the legacy my grandfather Elias had built. I stepped off the private elevator, my heels sinking into the plush carpet, and immediately felt the familiar, suffocating weight of my family's presence. They were gathered in the lobby outside the boardroom, a perfect tableau of manufactured black excellence. My mother, Valerie, stood front and center, draped in a pristine cream-colored designer suit, clutching a crocodile skin handbag that probably cost more than my first car. Beside her stood my father, Terence, his posture unnaturally straight, playing the role of the distinguished patriarch he had always pretended to be. My younger sister, Brianna, was perched on the edge of a leather sofa, obsessively checking her reflection in her smartphone camera, while her white husband, Preston, stood nearby, casually adjusting his heavy gold watch with an air of absolute entitlement. The moment the elevator doors chimed shut behind me, my mother turned. Her perfectly contoured smile vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer that transported me right back to my childhood. She marched across the lobby and deliberately placed herself between me and the boardroom doors, crossing her arms over her chest. "Did you come here to ask for bus fare?" she asked, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. "This is a private reading for your grandfather, Elias' actual heirs. The stray we kicked out at 11 does not get a seat at the table." I stopped a few feet away from her, keeping my face entirely blank. I did not shrink back, and I did not argue. I simply looked at the woman who had brought me into the world. "You are blocking the door, Valerie," I said quietly. My mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You do not belong here, Iman. You have not been part of this family since you were a child. We have a certain standard to maintain in our social circles, and having a disgruntled runaway hanging around trying to beg for scraps from the estate is not going to fly. We have worked too hard to build our reputation in the country club and among our peers to let you ruin it now." Before I could respond, Brianna stopped admiring her own reflection and chimed in, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Mom is right, Iman. You really should just leave." She walked over and linked her arm through our mother's. "Do you have any idea how hard it was for them? They had to sacrifice their entire anniversary trip in Cabo just to deal with your behavioral issues. They had to leave you with $200 at the airport because you were deliberately ruining my pageant tour with your bad attitude. You should be grateful they gave you any money at all before they left. Do not be greedy now just because Granddad passed away." The sheer audacity of her rewriting history was staggering. They had not left me at the airport because I had a bad attitude. They had left me standing alone at gate 24 with a crumpled wad of cash because I was an inconvenience to their new glamorous lifestyle, and my grandfather Elias had been the only one who bothered to come pick me up. But I did not point that out. I just kept my eyes fixed on the boardroom doors. That was when Preston decided it was time to intervene. He stepped forward, sliding his hands into the pockets of his tailored suit, flashing me a patronizing smile that was designed to make me feel small. Preston was a junior investment banker who came from old money, and he never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in the room of his superior financial knowledge. "Look," Iman, Preston said, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a toddler. "Trust law is incredibly complex. I deal with high net worth estates all the time. Even if Elias pitied you and kept you around, legacy wealth stays with the active operational members of the family. That is just how corporate structuring works. You have no legal standing here, but I tell you what, I am a generous guy. I will write you a personal check for $5,000 right now if you just turn around and leave. Think of it as a severance package so you do not leave empty-handed." He actually reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a silver pen. The absolute arrogance radiating from him was palpable. My father, Terence, nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by his son-in-law taking charge of the situation. I looked Preston up and down, then shifted my gaze back to my mother. "You can keep your charity, Preston," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "I am not here for a handout." My mother scoffed, her face twisting with sudden rage. She reached out and poked me hard in the shoulder. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little brat. You are going to turn around, get back in that elevator, and go back to whatever pathetic life you have been living. I am the matriarch of this family, and I am telling you that you are not walking through those doors." Just as her finger left my shoulder, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom clicked and swung open. Attorney Holloway stepped out into the lobby. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, impeccably dressed and fiercely loyal to my grandfather. He had managed the legal affairs of Elias Commercial Enterprises for decades. My mother immediately smoothed her jacket and put on her most charming, socially acceptable smile. "Arthur," she purred, stepping toward him. "I am so sorry for the commotion. We were just asking this unauthorized guest to leave so we could begin." Preston stepped forward, extending his hand toward the lawyer. "Mr. Holloway, Preston Wellington here. I am Brianna, husband. If you need security to remove this woman, I can make the call. We want to ensure the reading proceeds smoothly for the legitimate beneficiaries." Attorney Holloway completely ignored Preston's outstretched hand. He did not even look at my mother or my father. Instead, he walked straight past all of them, stopping directly in front of me. The entire family watched in stunned silence as the senior partner of the most prestigious law firm in the city bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "We have been waiting for your authorization to begin," Boss Holloway said clearly. "The boardroom is ready whenever you are." The silence that fell over the lobby was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that happens when the world shifts completely on its axis. My mother's smile froze and slowly slid off her face, leaving her mouth slightly open. Preston's hand dropped to his side, his patronizing smirk replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Brianna stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. "Shall we?" I said to Holloway, completely ignoring my family. I walked past my mother, my shoulder brushing against hers, and stepped into the grand boardroom. The room smelled of expensive leather and lemon polish. A massive oak table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed executive chairs. I bypassed the guest seating entirely and walked straight to the head of the table, taking the large leather chair that had always belonged to my grandfather. Holloway took his seat to my right, arranging his thick folders with practiced precision. My family filed into the room behind me, moving slowly like people walking through a dream. They took their seats on the opposite side of the long table. My father looked physically ill, while my mother kept glancing between me and Holloway, her mind clearly struggling to compute what had just happened. "Arthur," my mother finally said, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to regain control of the room. "I believe there has been some sort of mistake regarding the seating arrangements. That chair is reserved for the head of the family." "There is no mistake," Valerie Holloway replied without looking up from his documents. "Now, if we are all seated, I will begin the reading of the last will and testament of Elias." The legal language washed over the room, formal and binding. Holloway read through the standard clauses, the revocation of previous wills, and the minor charitable donations my grandfather had set up for local community centers. You could cut the tension in the room with a knife. Brianna was bouncing her knee impatiently, while Preston leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table, waiting for the massive numbers he was certain were coming his way. "We will begin with the individual bequests," Holloway announced, turning a page. "To my granddaughter, Brianna, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles currently housed in the secondary garage, as well as the title to the two-bedroom condominium located in the historic district." Brianna sat perfectly still for 3 agonizing seconds before she exploded. She slammed both hands flat onto the oak table, her designer rings clattering against the wood. "That is it!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. "A couple of old cars and a tiny apartment. Where is the cash? Where are the liquid assets?" Preston just lost his entire annual bonus because of unpredictable market shifts. We were counting on a significant cash disbursement to cover our living expenses for the next quarter. You cannot tell me the golden grandchild gets a 2-bedroom condo while this runaway sits at the head of the table. Preston grabbed Brianna's arm, trying to pull her back into her seat, looking mortified. Brianna, calm down. Let the man finish reading. But Brianna was hysterical now. I will not calm down. We need that money, Preston. We have payments due on the country club membership, and the lease on the Porsche is up next week. Granddad had millions in liquid capital. Where did it all go? I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, steepling my fingers together. I let her rant for another moment, letting the panic fully set in before I finally spoke. He did not lose his bonus, Brianna, I said. My voice was calm, cutting effortlessly through her hysterics. The room went dead silent again. Brianna glared at me across the table. What are you talking about? I picked up a sleek black folder that Holloway had placed in front of me earlier and slid it precisely across the polished oak table until it stopped right in front of my sister. I suggest you open that, I told her. Your husband did not lose his bonus due to market shifts. He was quietly terminated from Wellington Capital 2 weeks ago for insider trading. Preston's face turned the color of chalk. He lunged for the folder, but Brianna snatched it first, ripping it open. I kept my eyes locked on Preston as I continued. He has been funding your luxury influencer lifestyle, paying for those designer bags and those 5-star weekend getaways with high-interest payday loans and leveraged debt he can no longer afford. He lied to you about his finances, just like he lied to his compliance officers. That is defamation, Preston yelled, suddenly jumping to his feet. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his chest heaving. You cannot say things like that. I will sue you for everything you are worth. You have no idea who you are dealing with. My family will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your miserable life. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply let a small, cold smile touch my lips. Sue me with what money, Preston? I asked softly. Your corporate accounts are frozen pending a federal investigation. Your personal savings were drained to cover your margin calls. And your shared platinum credit cards were declined at the valet parking stand downstairs exactly 20 minutes ago. Brianna let out a choked gasp as she read the documents in the folder. It was all there. The termination notice, the massive debt statements, the final notices from creditors. She dropped the papers as if they were on fire and turned to stare at her husband in absolute horror. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy, untouchable life had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the boardroom table, and we had not even gotten to the main inheritance yet. Attorney Holloway cleared his throat loudly. The sound pulled everyone's attention away from the sobbing Brianna and the pale, sweating Preston. He adjusted his glasses and picked up the thickest stack of parchment on the table. We will now proceed to the primary assets of the estate, Holloway announced, his voice echoing in the tense room. To my son Terrence and my daughter-in-law Valerie, I leave full operational control of Elias Commercial Enterprises, including all subsidiary holding companies, and the deed to the primary family estate in Atlanta. My mother gasped. It was a loud, theatrical sound of pure triumph. She leapt up from her chair, her designer heels scraping against the hardwood floor, and threw her arms around my father. Terrence let out a massive breath, his chest puffing out as he wrapped his arms around his wife. The panic that had gripped them during Preston's public humiliation vanished instantly. My mother turned to me, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. She slammed her hands on the table, leaning forward to make sure I caught every word. Did you hear that, Iman? Full operational control. The entire empire belongs to us. You thought you could walk in here in your little business suit and watch us lose everything. You thought Elias would leave his life work to a runaway. But my husband is the patriarch now. We are the legacy. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not move. I just watched her unravel her true colors for everyone to see. You always blamed me for leaving you at that airport. My mother continued, her voice rising with manic energy. You played the victim for 19 years, but look at us now. Leaving you with your grandfather was the best decision I ever made for this family. I had to protect our social standing. I had to build our reputation in Atlanta. Do you think I could have become the regional president of the country club with a rebellious, ungrateful child dragging down my image? I had to focus on Brianna. I had to focus on building a brand of true Black excellence that the community would respect. My sacrifice paid off. We are worth hundreds of millions of dollars now, and you do not get a single dime. I tilted my head slightly. You are right about one thing, Valerie. I said, my voice smooth and calm. You certainly made a choice to protect your image, but you should really listen to the exact words Mr. Holloway used. He said operational control. He did not say ownership. My mother frowned, her triumphant smile faltering just a fraction. What are you talking about? Control means we run the company. It means we make the decisions. Holloway cleared his throat again, drawing their attention back to the head of the table. He did not look happy. In fact, he looked like a man about to deliver a death sentence. There is a secondary clause attached to this bequest, Valerie, he said gravely. Under the terms of the trust, the assumption of operational control requires the immediate assumption of all corporate liabilities. Specifically, Elias Commercial Enterprises carries a single consolidated debt, a corporate loan in the amount of $85 million. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. $85 million, my father choked out. That is impossible. The company generates millions in revenue every quarter. My father never had that kind of debt. We have been using the corporate accounts for 5 years without a single declined transaction. Holloway looked at him with profound pity. You have been able to use those accounts because the primary creditor has generously deferred the interest payments for the last 5 years to keep the company afloat. But the principal is now due. According to the contract, the balloon payment of $85 million must be paid in full by 5 p.m. tomorrow. If the debt is not settled, the creditor has the right to seize all company assets, including the Atlanta estate, and liquidate them immediately. My mother staggered backward, hitting her chair. She grabbed her chest, struggling to breathe. No, that cannot be real. We are rich. We are the elite of Atlanta. We cannot be bankrupt. Preston, who had been sitting in humiliated silence, suddenly saw an opportunity to save face. He stood up desperately, trying to project the confidence of a Wall Street executive. He straightened his tie and looked at my father. Terrence, do not panic, Preston said, using his best authoritative voice. This is standard corporate restructuring. The company is asset-rich, but cash-poor. My father's investment firm, Wellington Capital, specializes in distressed debt acquisitions. I can make a call right now. We will buy the paper from whoever holds this ridiculous loan. We will restructure the debt, extend the term to 20 years, and save the company. Of course, Wellington Capital will require a 90% equity stake in Elias Enterprises for taking on the risk, but you will avoid bankruptcy. You get to keep the house and the social status. Preston turned to me, a smug, patronizing look returning to his face. He leaned against the table, completely misreading the room. You see, Iman, this is how high-level finance works. It is not about emotional family drama. It is about leverage. You might have played a cute trick with my personal credit cards, but when it comes to institutional debt, the big boys step in. We will buy this debt and send you back to wherever you came from. I could not help it. I laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was a deep, resonant laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. The sound made Preston flinch. You are going to buy the debt, Preston, I asked, wiping an imaginary tear from my eye. You think Wellington Capital is going to save my parents? Yes. Preston snapped, his face reddening again. We buy distressed debt all the time. Tell me who the creditor is, Holloway. Who holds the $85 million note? Holloway adjusted his glasses, his hands visibly shaking as he looked at the documents. The creditor on record is a private equity firm known as Apex Holdings. My father looked frantically between Holloway and Preston. Do you know them, Preston? Can your father deal with them? Before Preston could answer, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen and slid it down the table so it rested right in front of my father. Allow me to explain what happened 5 years ago, I said. my voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. 5 years ago, Granddad had a massive stroke. The news leaked to the markets and the banks panicked. They called in all his commercial loans at once. He was facing immediate foreclosure on everything he had spent his life building. He called you Terrence. He called his only son for help. My father swallowed hard, refusing to look at me. But you did not answer, I continued relentlessly. You and Valerie were on a chartered yacht in Monaco, rubbing elbows with minor European royalty, desperate to secure a spot in a luxury magazine. You sent your own father calls to voicemail because you did not want his financial problems to ruin your vacation. So from his hospital bed, he called me. My mother shook her head in denial. You were a 25-year-old dropout. You had nothing. I was a 25-year-old software developer who had just sold her first tech startup for $120 million, I corrected her. I did not drop out because I failed. I dropped out because the curriculum was too slow for the company I was building. When Granddad called, I did not hesitate. I used my venture capital firm to buy out every single one of his loans. I consolidated his debt, deferred the interest, so you could keep living your lavish lifestyle in blissful ignorance, and I saved his legacy. I stood up, placing my hands on the table, leaning forward to look directly into my mother's terrified eyes. The name of my venture capital firm is Apex Holdings. I am the sole owner. I am the creditor. I own the $85 million note. You owe the money to me. The silence returned heavier and darker than before. The realization hit my parents with the force of a freight train. The daughter they had thrown away, the child they had deemed unworthy of their perfect image, now held the deed to their entire existence. Preston shook his head, trying to maintain his bravado. That does not change anything. Wellington Capital will still buy the debt from your firm. We have billions under management. My father will negotiate a buyout with you, and we will take control of the company. You cannot stop institutional money, Iman. I looked at Preston with pure pity. I almost felt bad for how clueless he was. Preston, I really wish you paid more attention to the financial markets instead of planning luxury vacations for my sister, I said softly. Apex Holdings executed a hostile takeover of Wellington Capital last Thursday. We bought up 60% of the voting shares through proxy buyers before your board even knew what hit them. We fired the entire executive team yesterday morning. Your father does not have a firm anymore. Your father works for me. And judging by the audit reports hitting my desk, he will be lucky if I do not report his accounting practices to the federal government. Preston's legs gave out. He literally collapsed into his chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He looked at Brianna, who was staring at him with absolute disgust. The man who had promised her unlimited wealth was entirely powerless, outplayed, and outmaneuvered by the sister she had spent her life mocking. My mother, realizing that her entire world was evaporating, suddenly changed her tactics. The arrogant socialite vanished, replaced by a desperate, weeping woman. She scrambled around the edge of the large table and rushed toward me, reaching out to grab my hands. "Iman, my sweet girl," she cried, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "You must understand. We were protecting you. We wanted you to be strong. I know you are angry, but you would never destroy your own family. You are my daughter. You would never put your own mother on the street. We can run the company together. You and me." I looked down at her hands, grasping mine. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no longing for a mother love. Just pure, unadulterated apathy. I calmly pulled my hands out of her grip and took a step back. I smoothed the front of my jacket, looking down at the woman who had caused me so much pain. "Do not call me your daughter Valerie," I said, my voice ringing with finality. "You told me 19 years ago at Gate 24 to figure it out on my own. You told me I was excess baggage. You made your choice for the sake of your social standing. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. The $85 million is due tomorrow at 5. Figure it out." The heavy silence in the boardroom was only broken by the sound of Preston's ragged breathing as he stared at the financial ruin laid bare on the mahogany table before him. Brianna sat frozen beside him, her carefully contoured face twisted into a mask of absolute horror and betrayal. She had married for money and status, and in one single moment, I had stripped both away from her. But my mother Valerie was not a woman who allowed defeat to linger in her presence for very long. She quickly averted her eyes from her golden child disgraced husband and snapped her attention back to Attorney Holloway, refusing to let the unpleasant reality of their situation ruin her grand moment. Holloway adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, completely unbothered by the catastrophic implosion of my sister marriage that had just occurred right in front of him. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding the room attention as he turned to the next page of the heavy parchment document. The sound snapped my father Terence out of his shock. He leaned forward, rubbing his palms together, his eyes fixed hungrily on the legal papers, as if they contained the secrets to the universe. "We will now proceed to the disposition of the primary estate Holloway," announced his voice steady and formal. "Regarding Elias Commercial Enterprises and all associated holding companies, including the primary family estate in Atlanta, my client has left specific instructions." My parents practically vibrated with anticipation. My father wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white under her flawless manicure. This was the moment they had been waiting for since my grandfather took his last breath. The moment that would permanently cement their status in the elite social circles they worshipped and validate every ruthless decision they had ever made. "I leave full operational control of Elias Commercial Enterprises to my son Terence," and his wife, Valerie Holloway, read aloud the words hanging heavy in the quiet air. My mother let out a sharp, dramatic gasp of pure triumph that echoed off the boardroom walls. She leaped up from her heavy leather chair, the sudden movement nearly knocking it over backward. She threw her arms around my father, who let out a booming laugh of victory. Terence puffed out his chest, clapping his hands together as the tension melted from his broad shoulders. In an instant, they forgot all about Preston and Brianna and their impending financial disaster. They had won the empire. They were the masters of their universe once again. Valerie turned to face me, her eyes blazing with a toxic mixture of arrogance and vindictive joy. She leaned her hands flat against the polished oak table and smiled a smile so cruel it transported me straight back to the day she left me standing alone at Gate 24 with nothing but a worthless wad of cash and a broken heart. "Did you hear that, Iman?" She mocked, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "Full operational control. The entire legacy belongs to us now. You thought you could walk in here in your little custom-tailored business suit and watch us lose everything. You really thought Elias would leave his life work to the runaway stray he took in out of pity. But my husband is the patriarch now. We are the legacy." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my face entirely blank, just watching her unravel her true colors for everyone in the room to see. "You always blamed me for leaving you at that airport?" My mother continued pacing slightly behind her chair, her voice rising with manic energy. "You played the victim for 19 years, holding on to that pathetic grudge. But look at us now. Leaving you behind was the best thing I ever did to protect this family. I had to protect our social standing. I had to build our reputation in the upper echelons of Atlanta society. Do you honestly think I could have become the regional president of the country club with a rebellious, ungrateful child dragging down my image? I had to focus my energy on Brianna. I had to focus on building a brand of true Black excellence that the entire community would respect and envy." She gestured broadly around the luxurious boardroom, acting as if she already owned the very walls surrounding us. "My sacrifice paid off," she boasted proudly. "We are worth hundreds of millions of dollars now. We are untouchable, and you do not get a single dime of it." I tilted my head slightly, letting her harsh words wash over me. She had finally said it out loud. She had abandoned her 11-year-old daughter, not out of necessity, but because I did not fit her pristine country club aesthetic. She had traded my childhood for a seat at elite charity galas and a faux crown of social superiority. "You are right about one thing, Valerie," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You certainly made a choice to protect your precious image, but you really should pay closer attention to the exact words Mr. Holloway just used. He said operational control. He did not say ownership." My mother frowned, her triumphant smile faltering just a fraction as confusion clouded her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. Control means we run the company. It means we make the decisions. It means the money is ours. Holloway cleared his throat again, cutting through her arrogant delusion. He did not look happy. In fact, he looked like a man about to deliver a death sentence. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder, placing it squarely in front of my father on the polished wood surface. "There is a secondary clause attached to this bequest," Valerie Holloway said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Under the explicit terms of the trust, the assumption of operational control requires the immediate assumption of all corporate liabilities. Specifically, Elias Commercial Enterprises currently carries a single consolidated debt. It is a corporate loan in the amount of $85 million. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. The triumphant laugh died in his throat, replaced by a choking sound. He gripped the edge of the table, staring at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. $85 million, my father stammered, his voice cracking. "That is impossible. The company generates millions in revenue every quarter. My father never carried that kind of toxic debt. We have been using the corporate credit accounts for 5 years without a single declined transaction. There must be a mistake in the accounting." Holloway looked at him with profound pity, adjusting his glasses before he delivered the final blow. "You have been able to use those accounts because the primary creditor has generously deferred the interest payments for the last 5 years to keep the company afloat without liquidating assets. But the deferment period has ended and the principal is now due. According to the binding contract within that folder, the balloon payment of exactly $85 million must be paid in full by 5 p.m. tomorrow. If the debt is not completely settled, the creditor has the absolute legal right to seize all company assets, including the Atlanta estate, and liquidate them immediately." My mother staggered backward, hitting the edge of her chair. She grabbed her chest, her breathing turning into shallow, panicked gasps. "No," she whispered, shaking her head frantically. "No, that cannot be real. We are rich. We are the elite of Atlanta. We cannot be bankrupt." I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the illusion of their supreme power turn to ash right before my very eyes. The absolute silence in the boardroom fractured all at once. The reality of an $85 million balloon payment crashing down on my parents was like watching a physical structure collapse. My father Terrence began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, his expensive custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big as he slumped forward in his chair. He was gasping for air, pulling at his silk tie as if it were a noose tightening around his neck. The man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable Atlanta wealth was completely coming apart at the seams. Valerie, on the other hand, turned her panic outward into pure venom. She slammed her hands on the table and leaned toward Attorney Holloway, her eyes wild and frantic. "That is a lie," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Elias was a titan. He owned half the commercial blocks in Midtown. He had generational wealth. How could he possibly be $85 million in debt? Where did the money go, Arthur? Tell me right now." Holloway did not flinch at her outburst. He merely adjusted his glasses and looked at her with the cold detachment of a man who dealt in facts, not delusions. "Commercial real estate relies heavily on leverage, Valerie," he explained calmly. "When the markets shifted and occupancy rates plummeted a few years ago, the banks required additional collateral to maintain his credit lines. Elias leveraged the operational company to keep the real estate portfolio afloat. It is a common practice, but it carries significant risk. The debt was restructured 5 years ago with a balloon payment due upon his passing, or at the end of the 5-year term. That term ends tomorrow, at 5 in the evening." My mother, face twisted in absolute horror. She looked at my father, who was still struggling to catch his breath, staring blankly at the red folder on the table. "Terrence, do something," she hissed, grabbing his arm and shaking it. "Call the bank. Call your friends at the club. We cannot lose the house. We cannot lose the foundation. The gala is next month. I have already sent out the invitations." Even in the face of complete financial ruin, my mother's primary concern was a charity gala and her social standing. It was pathetic, but entirely predictable. That was when Preston saw his opening. My brother-in-law had been sitting in humiliated silence ever since I exposed his termination and his crushing debt. His ego had been bruised, his alpha male facade entirely shattered in front of his wife. But hearing about an $85 million distressed loan suddenly sparked something in his eyes. This was his territory. This was the language he spoke. He saw a lifeline not just to save his own dignity, but to seize absolute control of my family legacy. Preston slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant smoothness. He cleared his throat, adopting the condescending tone he usually reserved for waiters and valet drivers. "Relax, Terrence," Preston said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Take a deep breath. There is no need for anyone to panic. This is just business." My father looked up at him, his eyes red and desperate. "Business. Preston, they are going to take my father company. They are going to take my home. How is this just business? Because distressed debt is exactly what my father firm specializes in," Preston said, a smug smirk creeping back onto his face. He began to pace slowly behind Brianna's chair, looking at my parents like a predator sizing up wounded prey. Wellington Capital handles situations exactly like this every single day. We buy toxic paper from banks and private lenders who do not want to deal with the hassle of collection and liquidation. Brianna looked up at her husband, a glimmer of desperate hope returning to her tear-stained face. "Preston, what are you saying? Can your dad fix this?" Preston puffed out his chest, looking down at my sister. "I am saying I can make a phone call right now, Brianna. I can call my father and have Wellington Capital step in as the White Knight. We will purchase the $85 million note from whoever holds it. We will restructure the debt, extend the terms to 20 or 30 years, and inject enough working capital to keep the operational company running smoothly. You get to avoid bankruptcy. You keep the Atlanta mansion. Valerie gets to host her gala and keep her country club presidency. The public never has to know how close you came to the edge." My mother let out a loud gasp of relief. She looked at Preston as if he were a savior descending from heaven. "Oh, Preston, thank God. You are a lifesaver. I knew you were the right choice for our Brianna. Terrence, do you hear this? Preston is going to save the company." My father nodded vigorously, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Thank you, Preston. We are incredibly grateful. Let us get your father on the phone right away to sort out the details." Preston held up a single finger, his smirk widening into something predatory. "Hold on, Terrence. I said we could save the company, but I did not say it would be a charity mission. Wellington Capital takes on massive risk when acquiring distressed assets of this magnitude. To justify the exposure to our board and to structure the bailout properly, we will need equity." My father frowned slightly. "Equity? Of course. We can offer you a seat on the board and perhaps 10 or 15% of the shares." Preston laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. 10%. Terrence, you do not seem to grasp the reality of your situation. You do not have leverage here. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., you are legally bankrupt. To save your lifestyle and clear this debt, Wellington Capital will require a 90% equity stake in Elias Commercial Enterprises. We will own the company. You and Valerie can retain a 10% minority share and figurehead titles to keep up appearances in Atlanta, but all operational control and future profits will belong to Wellington. It is just business." The room went dead quiet. Preston was effectively stealing my grandfather's lifelong work, stripping away the black wealth Elias had built from scratch and transferring it directly into the hands of his wealthy white family. He was holding my parents hostage, using their desperation to maintain their country club facade against them. And the most pathetic part was that my parents were actually considering it. I watched my mother look at my father. They communicated silently, weighing the options. Lose everything and face public humiliation, or hand over 90% of Elias Empire to Preston family and keep the mansion and the social status. They were willing to sell out my grandfather's legacy just to keep up the illusion of power. It was the ultimate betrayal of everything Elias had worked for. I could not contain it any longer. A laugh bubbled up from the depths of my chest. It started soft, but quickly grew into a loud, cold sound that echoed off the boardroom walls. It was a terrifying laugh, devoid of any warmth or humor. Every head at the table snapped toward me. Preston stopped pacing, his smug smile faltering as he looked at me. "What is so funny, Iman?" he demanded, his voice defensive. "You do not understand institutional finance. You should just sit there and let the adults handle this." I stopped laughing and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the heavy oak table. I looked Preston dead in the eyes, my gaze locking onto his with absolute lethal precision. "Wellington Capital cannot save you, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper that commanded the entire room. "Because Wellington Capital does not own the debt." Preston froze, his arrogant smirk dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. He looked around the room as if waiting for someone to explain a joke he simply did not understand. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its confident edge as it echoed in the large room. "Every distressed asset in this city passes through my father's desk before it goes anywhere else. You are bluffing, Iman. You are just trying to buy time because you know we have you cornered and you cannot stand the thought of losing." I did not bother arguing with a man whose entire identity was built on his father money and unearned privilege. Instead, I reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out my silver iPad. The room watched in stunned silence as I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked over to the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall of the boardroom. I plugged a small display cable into the side of my device. A second later, the screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, bright light over the terrified faces of my family members. "Allow me to give you a brief lesson in family history," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. 5 years ago, Granddad suffered a massive stroke. It was kept out of the press to protect the company's stock, but the financial markets are not stupid. Rumors leaked through the whispers of the Atlanta elite. The banks panicked and they immediately called in all of his commercial loans at once. He was facing immediate and total foreclosure on every single property he had spent his entire life building. His legacy was hours away from being completely liquidated and sold off for parts to the highest bidder. I tapped the screen, and a series of complex financial documents appeared, highlighting the massive debts and the impending foreclosure notices from major national banks. My father Terrence stared at the screen, his mouth hanging slightly open. He knew nothing about this crisis, because he had never bothered to look past his own monthly allowance and his country club tea times. "Granddad called you Terrence," I said, turning my gaze directly onto my father. "He called his only son begging for help to save the family empire. But you did not answer the phone. You and Valerie were too busy hosting lavish charity galas and posing for luxury magazine covers to pick up the phone and save his life work. You ignored his desperate voicemails because you thought he was just being demanding and ruining your perfect social calendar. So from his hospital bed, he called the only person he knew would actually show up when things got difficult. He called me." Valerie shook her head, her perfectly styled hair trembling with the force of her absolute denial. "That is impossible," she hissed, slamming her palm on the table again. "You were a college dropout. You had absolutely nothing to your name. You were a nobody living in a cheap apartment pretending to be an entrepreneur." I tapped the screen again, bringing up a new set of highly classified banking documents. I was a software developer who had just sold her first tech startup for $120 million. I corrected her, my tone razor sharp and unforgiving. "I did not drop out because I was a failure, Valerie. I dropped out because the university curriculum was far too slow for the advanced artificial intelligence platform I was building in my dorm room." When Granddad called me, I did not hesitate for a single second. I used the capital from my massive buyout to establish a private equity firm. I bought up every single one of his toxic commercial loans in cash. I consolidated his massive debt and generously deferred the interest payments so you and Terrence could continue living your pathetic, hollow lives in absolute blissful ignorance. The silence in the room was completely deafening. The horrific realization was hitting them like physical blows to the chest. They were staring at a ghost who had suddenly revealed herself to be a financial titan, holding their entire lives in the palm of her hand. "The name of my private equity firm is Apex Holdings," I announced, letting the powerful name hang in the heavy air of the boardroom. I am the sole founder and the sole owner. I am the primary creditor holding the $85 million note on Elias Commercial Enterprises. The Atlanta estate, the holding companies, the corporate accounts they all belong to. Apex Holdings, until that debt is cleared in full. You owe the $85 million to me. My father looked like he was about to pass out on the floor. He grabbed his chest, taking shallow, frantic breaths as his entire world completely collapsed around him. Brianna let out a soft, pathetic sob, covering her mouth with her hands, as she finally realized that the immense wealth she had based her entire personality on was nothing but a mirage sustained by the very sister she had relentlessly bullied. But Preston was still not quite ready to surrender his fragile alpha male fantasy. He shook his head violently, stepping away from Brianna's chair and pointing an accusing finger at the glowing screen. "That does not change a single thing," Preston shouted, his voice cracking with unchecked desperation. "It does not matter if you personally own the debt. Wellington Capital has billions of dollars under management. My father will buy the note directly from your little firm. We will crush your equity stake and take the properties anyway. You cannot stop institutional money, Iman. You are just one little girl playing a corporate game you simply do not understand." I looked at Preston with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He was so deeply entrenched in his own inherited privilege that he could not see the freight train heading straight toward him. I tapped the iPad screen one final time. A breaking news press release from the Wall Street Journal filled the massive monitor for everyone to read. "Preston, I really wish you paid more attention to the global financial markets instead of planning luxury vacations for my sister," I said softly, the absolute finality in my voice making him flinch backward. Apex Holdings is not a little firm. We manage immense assets across 3 continents. And speaking of Apex Holdings, we executed a hostile takeover of Wellington Capital last Thursday. Preston's jaw dropped completely open. He stopped pointing his hand, falling limply to his side as the blood rushed out of his face. "We utilized anonymous proxy buyers to aggressively acquire 60% of your voting shares before your bloated board of directors even knew what hit them." I continued, relentlessly watching his spirit break. "I fired your entire executive management team yesterday morning. Your father does not have a firm anymore, Preston. Your father works for me now. And judging by the catastrophic audit reports currently hitting my desk, your father will be incredibly lucky if I do not report his highly illegal accounting practices to the federal government by the end of the week." Preston's legs literally gave out from beneath him. He collapsed backward into an empty leather chair, his mouth opening and closing without making a single sound. The arrogant white knight who had stood up just moments ago to claim my family legacy was completely destroyed, reduced to a trembling, powerless shell of a man. Brianna stared at him with absolute revulsion, realizing the billionaire savior she had married was now entirely unemployed and at my mercy. I unplugged my iPad and slid it smoothly into my briefcase. The sharp click of the metal latch sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly silent boardroom. I looked down the length of the mahogany table, making direct eye contact with every single person who had ever made me feel small and unworthy. So I said, breaking the heavy silence with a calm voice that demanded absolute submission, "To whom will you be making that $85 million check payable tomorrow?" The heavy silence that followed my question was broken by the sound of Brianna breathing. It was fast and shallow, the sound of a woman watching her entire carefully constructed reality shatter into pieces. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston, her perfectly manicured hands trembling where they rested on the mahogany table. The man she had married just 2 years ago, the supposed billionaire heir who was supposed to guarantee her a life of endless luxury and absolute privilege, was slouched in his chair staring blankly at the floor. "You lied to me, Preston," Brianna whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic and rage. "You told me Wellington Capital was bulletproof. You told me your father was an untouchable titan of Wall Street. You promised me an empire, Preston, and now you are telling me you are unemployed. You are broke." Your entire family was just bought out and fired by my sister. Preston, head snapped up his face, flushing a deep, angry crimson. He was already humiliated beyond repair, and Brianna's words were the final spark that ignited his wounded ego. He leaped out of his chair, pointing an aggressive finger directly at his wife's face. "Do not you dare play the innocent victim with me, Brianna!" Preston shouted, his voice echoing harshly off the walls. "You are nothing but a greedy gold digger, and you always have been. You never cared about me or my family. You only cared about the black card in my wallet and the prestige of my last name. You maxed out 3 of my personal credit cards last month just buying designer handbags to impress your fake little friends at the country club." Brianna stood up instantly, her chair tipping backward and crashing loudly against the floor. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screamed, completely abandoning the poised society wife persona she had spent years perfecting. "I gave you the best years of my youth, Preston. I elevated your social standing in Atlanta. I was the ultimate trophy wife for your pathetic, fragile ego. And you dragged me down into your miserable failure. You cannot even protect your own family company from a woman you called a dropout just 10 minutes ago. You are a parasite!" Brianna Preston fired back, leaning across the table, his face twisted with pure malice. "You are a parasite just like your mother. You leech off anyone with a bank account to fund your empty, shallow life. You think you elevated me. My friends laughed at you behind your back. They all knew you were just a desperate social climber looking for a free ride. And now that the ride is over, you are showing everyone exactly what you are. You are nothing without my money, Brianna. Absolutely nothing." The boardroom devolved into absolute chaos. The golden couple, the shining beacon of perfection that my parents had paraded around Atlanta society for years, were tearing each other apart like wild animals. Brianna was screaming obscenities that would have gotten her permanently banned from every country club in the state. She threw her heavy crystal water glass across the table. It shattered against the wall right behind Preston, sending water and sharp shards of glass raining down onto the expensive carpet. Preston was yelling back, calling her every degrading name in the book, entirely stripped of his polished corporate veneer. My mother sat paralyzed in her chair. Valerie's hands were covering her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute horror as she watched her perfect legacy completely self-destruct in front of the estate attorney. She had sacrificed my childhood and discarded me at an airport to build this specific future, and now it was burning to the ground. The pristine image of true black excellence she had worshipped was entirely gone, replaced by 2 greedy, bankrupt strangers screaming at each other over an empty bank account. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table watching the fire consume them. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to stop them. I just let them burn. Terrence suddenly slammed his heavy fists onto the boardroom table, the loud bang temporarily startling Brianna and Preston into silence. My father's chest was heaving, his face a dangerous shade of red, as he desperately tried to regain control of a room that had completely slipped from his grasp. He stood up, drawing himself to his full height, trying to project the towering authority he had used to intimidate people for decades. He looked away from the shattered glass and the weeping Valerie, and locked his furious gaze directly on me. He still thought he held some inherent power over me simply because of his biology. He still believed that demanding obedience would somehow erase an $85 million corporate debt. "Iman, enough!" Terrence bellowed, his deep voice vibrating with desperate rage. "I gave you life. I am your father. You will forgive this debt out of respect for your elders." I did not even blink at his sudden outburst. His desperate roar hung in the stagnant air of the boardroom, but it carried absolutely no weight anymore. Terrence was a hollow shell of a man, demanding respect he had never once earned in his entire miserable life. The veins in his neck were bulging, and his fists were clenched, but all I saw was a cornered coward who finally realized his empty threats could no longer save him. Instead of answering his ridiculous demand, I simply broke eye contact and turned my attention back to my open briefcase. I reached inside, bypassing the sleek modern electronics and the polished corporate reports. I pulled out something much older and far more damaging. It was a thick, black leather-bound ledger. The edges of the cover were worn smooth from years of handling, and the pages were slightly yellowed with age. The dull, heavy thud it made as I dropped it onto the thick oak table seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Attorney Holloway adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair, silently observing the execution. Respect is a fascinating concept, Terrence, I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or emotion. It is usually something that is earned through integrity and care, not something you can just demand, because you share a fraction of my DNA. You want to talk about respect, as if you are some revered patriarch who built this family with your bare hands. So let us talk about how you respected the future your own father tried to secure for me. I flipped the heavy ledger open to a specific page marked with a bright red sticky note. My grandfather was a man who understood the fundamental value of education and independence. When I was 8 years old, long before Valerie decided my mere existence was a threat to her pristine country club aesthetic, Granddad set up a private trust fund in my name. It was a dedicated college fund designed to guarantee that I would never have to worry about paying for my education, no matter what happened to the family business. He deposited exactly $500,000 into that locked account. It was supposed to remain completely untouched until my 18th birthday. My father swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously as his wide eyes darted toward the old ledger. He knew exactly what book I was holding. The aggressive color had suddenly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale. I kept my eyes locked on his sweating face as I continued speaking, my words cutting through the silence like a scalpel. When you and Valerie abandoned me at gate 24 with $200 and a casual wave goodbye, you did not just leave me to fend for myself in a strange city. You went back to his estate while he was recovering from his first minor stroke, and you illegally accessed his private physical files. You forged your own father's signature on the trust release documents, and you completely drained my account. You stole $500,000 from an abandoned 15-year-old girl because you thought I would never be smart enough or powerful enough to find out. I placed my hand flat on the open ledger and slowly slid it across the smooth mahogany wood. The heavy book glided silently until it stopped right in front of Brianna. She stared down at the columns of printed numbers, the copied bank transfer receipts, and the forged signature pages. Her tear-streaked face was frozen in a mask of horrified confusion. She had just realized her husband was a penniless fraud, and now she was about to learn that her own perfect fairy tale life was built entirely on stolen money. Look closely at the dates of those wire transfers, Brianna. I instructed, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. Look at where that $500,000 went. It did not go into the corporate accounts to save the company during a rough quarter. It did not go toward any legitimate real estate investments. Terrence and Valerie funneled every single cent of my college fund into a private shell account that was exclusively used to pay for your lavish destination wedding. Brianna let out a choked, agonizing gasp as her eyes traced the highlighted lines on the financial documents. She remembered every single detail of that extravagant week in Italy. The custom-imported flowers draping the historic villa, the private boat tours on Lake Como, the vintage champagne flowing like water, and that ridiculous custom designer gown she wore. It was the society event of the season, carefully orchestrated to make sure every other wealthy family in Atlanta turned green with absolute envy. You literally walked down the aisle on the money meant for my education? I said, letting the absolute reality of her perfect day completely sink in. Every single compliment you received, every beautiful professional photograph you posted on social media, it was all paid for by the literal theft of my future. My parents stripped me of my safety net so you could have a temporary fairy tale that just ended with your unemployed husband screaming obscenities at you in this very room. Terrence began to violently stammer, waving his hands frantically in the air as he tried to formulate a coherent excuse. Iman, you do not understand. He sputtered, his voice weak and trembling with panic. The company was going through a brief cash flow issue at the time. We needed immediate liquidity for vendors. We fully intended to pay it back before you turned 18 and needed it for tuition. It was just a temporary reallocation of family assets to keep everything afloat. But Valerie could not stand to see her husband cowering like a beaten dog. Her panic suddenly morphed into a vicious and aggressive defense. She stepped forward, planting herself firmly between Terence and the table, pointing a sharp manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not you dare sit there and act like some tragic innocent martyr!" Valerie spat, her face contorted with ugly self-righteous rage. "You did not deserve that money anyway. You were a runaway and a complete embarrassment. You refused to conform to our standards and you dropped out of a prestigious university to play with computers in a filthy dorm room. Why should $500,000 sit in a useless bank account when your sister needed to establish her proper social standing? Brianna deserved a wedding that reflected our true elite status in this city. You were never going to use that money properly, so we put it to good use." The sheer audacity of her justification hung in the heavy air of the boardroom. She genuinely believed that her obsessive social climbing excused the deliberate theft of a child's future. She thought her twisted country club logic would somehow shield her from the severe reality of what they had actually done. I did not yell back at her. I did not try to argue with her delusion. I just looked at my mother and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The trap was finally completely shut, and they had walked right into it. "That is fine," I said, my voice perfectly calm and pleasantly detached. "You can rationalize it however you want to help yourself sleep at night, Valerie. But what you and Terence executed was textbook wire fraud and grand larceny. And unfortunately for both of you, the federal statute of limitations on those specific financial crimes has not yet expired." The threat of federal prison hung over the boardroom, heavy and suffocating. Terence stared at me, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He looked at the open ledger and then at Attorney Holloway, who was calmly taking notes on his yellow legal pad. The realization that his entire facade was crumbling, that the immense privilege he had hidden behind his whole life could not shield him from a federal indictment, finally snapped his fragile mind. He did what cowards always do when they are backed into a corner. He turned on the person closest to him. "It was not my idea," Terence blurted out, his voice cracking as he scrambled away from his wife. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Valerie's chest. "It was entirely her operation, Iman. Valerie needed the wedding to be featured in Vogue magazine to secure her vice presidency position at the country club. She is the one who found the trust documents in your grandfather's study. She brought them to me and demanded I sign them. She said you were a runaway and no one would ever know. I never wanted to touch your college fund, but she would not stop screaming about the wedding budget. She told me it was an investment in our social capital. She said if Brianna married into the Wellington family, it would bring new investors into our firm. I was just trying to keep the peace in my own house." Valerie let out a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. She stared at the man she had been married to for over 30 years, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief and pure hatred. She looked at him as if he were a cockroach she had just scraped off the bottom of her expensive shoe. The polished high society matriarch who had controlled every narrative in our family was completely unraveling before my eyes. "You spineless, pathetic little worm!" Valerie hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried across the silent room. "You are going to stand there and blame me for securing our daughter's future when you have been bleeding this family dry for over a decade." Terence tried to step back, but Valerie was already advancing on him. She slammed her hands onto the mahogany table, leaning toward him like a predator. Attorney Holloway did not even blink as he continued writing every single word down on his legal pad. "You want to talk about financial crimes?" Terence Valerie shouted, her composure entirely gone. "Let us talk about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Let us tell Iman exactly how you have been siphoning money from the corporate operating budget to fund your endless string of 20-something mistresses in Miami and New York. You bought that girl a luxury condo in Brickell, using the company emergency reserve fund, while Granddad was literally fighting for his life in intensive care. You forged his signature on corporate checks long before I ever touched that college trust. You chartered private jets under fake marketing expenses just to fly your little girlfriends to the Bahamas." Terrence's face flushed a violently dark purple. "Shut your mouth, Valerie!" he bellowed, raising his hand as if he wanted to strike her. "You have no idea what you are talking about. You have not looked at a balance sheet in your entire miserable life. You are just a glorified party planner who spends my money. I know you have 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware that you use to hide your assets from the IRS." Valerie screamed right back, completely ignoring his hollow threat. "I know because I found the paperwork in your safe 2 years ago, and I made copies of every single page. If you try to throw me under the bus for a wedding you attended and bragged about, I will personally hand those files over to the federal investigators. I will gladly watch you rot in a federal penitentiary before I let you pin this on me. You are not taking me down to save your own pathetic skin, Terrence." The two of them stood there screaming at each other, tearing down decades of carefully curated lies and deceit. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were confessing to massive federal crimes in front of the estate lawyer and the very person who held their financial lives in her hands. They were exposing each other's deepest, darkest secrets, burning down whatever scraps of dignity their marriage had left. The golden couple of Atlanta society, the pillars of the community who had looked down on me my entire life, were nothing but a pair of greedy, desperate criminals trying to destroy one another to save their own skin. I watched the spectacle with absolute emotional detachment. The people who had mocked me, belittled me, and abandoned me at Gate 24 were currently destroying each other without me having to lift a single finger. The snake was finally eating its own tail. It was a beautiful, poetic justice that I could never have orchestrated on my own. Their greed was the very thing that had brought them to this room, and their greed was the exact thing that was tearing them apart. I felt a slight movement to my left. Brianna had slipped out of her chair while her parents were screaming at each other. She moved silently along the edge of the long boardroom table, her eyes fixed on my briefcase. She looked completely ruined. She glanced briefly at her husband Preston, who was still slouched in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, completely broken by the realization that his family firm was gone. Brianna knew he could not save her anymore. Her parents were facing prison, and the $85 million debt I held was threatening to swallow whatever personal assets she thought she possessed. She was completely alone. She reached into her designer handbag, her hands trembling so badly she could barely manipulate the zipper. She pulled out a small silver USB drive and slid it slowly across the polished wood. It stopped right next to my hand. I looked from the drive to my sister's tear-streaked, ruined face. The arrogant bully who had tormented me for years was completely gone, replaced by a terrified woman willing to sell out her own mother to save herself. "I have something worse on Mom," Brianna whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our parents' continuing screaming match. "Something that will put her away for a very long time. Let me walk away, Iman. Clear my name from the Apex Holdings debt collection. Let me walk out of this room right now and it is yours." The moment those desperate words left Brianna's mouth, the remaining air was sucked completely out of the boardroom. The fragile illusion of family loyalty that my parents had preached to me my entire life evaporated in a single heartbeat. Valerie stared at her youngest daughter, her golden child, the one she had literally stolen my future to protect, and for a split second, there was absolute paralyzing silence. Then Valerie let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a feral, high-pitched screech of pure animalistic rage. All the polished country club elegance, the careful diction, and the perfectly cultivated manners vanished. She lunged across the heavy mahogany table, her manicured hands curled into claws, aiming directly for Brianna's face. She knocked over heavy leather chairs and sent silver pens clattering across the floor, driven by a sudden violent need to destroy the daughter who had just sold her out. But before she could reach her target, Preston suddenly moved. Fueled by his own humiliated rage and his utter disgust for the woman who had just insulted him, Preston stepped forcefully in front of his wife. He caught Valerie by the shoulders and shoved her violently backward. Valerie stumbled awkwardly in her expensive designer heels, her arms flailing before she crashed back against the edge of the conference table. "Stay away from her!" Valerie Preston shouted, his chest heaving as he stood between his wife and her deranged mother. His face was twisted in a snarl, glad to finally have someone else to blame for his catastrophic downfall. Brianna was trembling so violently, she had to grip the edge of the table with both hands just to keep herself standing. She looked at her mother with a mixture of absolute terror and cold, calculated survival instinct. She knew the only way out of the $85 million trap I had built was to hand me the one person who deserved to be punished more than she did. "Tell her," Brianna Valerie screamed, her voice cracking as she leaned against the table, fighting to catch her breath. "You ungrateful little brat, after everything I sacrificed for you, after the social standing I built for you, do not you dare say another word." But Brianna did not look at her mother anymore. She kept her tear-streaked eyes locked entirely on me. Her voice shook at first, but as she kept talking, the words spilled out in a rushed, desperate torrent. "The Elias Family Charitable Foundation," Brianna blurted out, her words echoing in the vast empty spaces of the room. "Granddad set it up 20 years ago. It was a massive endowment specifically meant to provide full academic scholarships and build community resource centers for underprivileged Black youth across Atlanta. It was supposed to be his ultimate legacy, his way of giving back to the community that supported his early businesses." Brianna took a shaky breath, pointing a trembling finger at our mother. "Mom is the primary executor of the foundation board. She has been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the charity for the past 8 years. She created fake vendor invoices and phantom community outreach programs to siphon the cash directly into her personal offshore accounts. She drained the charity dry." Iman. Terrence turned to look at his wife, his jaw dropping completely open. He had been stealing from the corporate side to fund his string of mistresses. But stealing from a charitable foundation meant for disadvantaged children was a level of depravity even he had not anticipated. The media backlash alone would be enough to destroy the family name forever, to ensure they could never show their faces in polite society again. He stared at Valerie as if she were a total stranger, a monster wearing his wife's skin. "She used the charity money to fund her entire lifestyle," Brianna continued, her voice growing louder and more frantic as she sold her mother out to save herself. The designer handbags she flaunts at the country club, the custom jewelry, the sudden luxury vacations to Paris and Milan. She even used the foundation scholarship funds to pay for her endless cosmetic surgeries in Beverly Hills. She literally stole college educations from poor kids so she could get a facelift and carry a Birkin bag. She has been living a lie funded by stolen charity money. Valerie's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her perfectly curated high society image, the refined, elegant facade she had used to terrorize me and look down on everyone else in Atlanta, was completely shattered. She was not a pillar of the community. She was a common thief, a parasite who preyed on charity money meant for children just to feed her own bottomless vanity. She looked wildly around the room, realizing that her darkest secret was out in the open, and there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. "It is all on that drive," Brianna said, nodding toward the small silver USB stick resting near my hand on the polished wood. "I found her hidden ledgers when I was looking for cash to cover Preston credit card bills. I downloaded everything. Every fake invoice, every offshore transfer routing number, every single receipt from her plastic surgeons. I have all the proof you need, Aman. Just take it and let me go. Let me and Preston walk away from the Apex Holdings debt, and the drive is yours. You can send her to federal prison and keep your money. Just let us walk out of this room right now." The room fell dead silent again, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Terrence was staring at Valerie with absolute disgust. Valerie was staring at Brianna with a look of murderous betrayal. And Brianna was staring at me, waiting for me to accept her desperate plea bargain. They were a family of vipers, and they had finally turned their fangs on each other when the fire got too hot. They were willing to destroy each other completely, just to save their own miserable skins. I looked down at the small silver drive resting on the table. It was the ultimate weapon, the key to completely destroying my mother's life and putting her behind bars for decades. All I had to do was pick it up and let my sister walk away, scot-free from the financial ruin she so deeply deserved. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute misery of the moment to settle deep into their bones. I looked at Brianna, desperate, pleading eyes, and then I looked at my mother, terrified, shattered face. I did not reach for the USB drive. I did not even twitch a finger toward it. Instead, I calmly reached my hand back into my sleek leather briefcase. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room as I pulled out a thick, professionally bound document sealed in a clear plastic cover. I set it gently onto the table right next to Brianna's bargaining chip. I looked directly into my sister's panicked eyes and let a cold, empty smile touch my lips. "I do not need your stolen files, Brianna," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed, without a single trace of pity. "I know exactly what she did to the foundation. This document is a fully completed comprehensive forensic audit of the Elias Family Charitable Foundation, executed by an independent third-party accounting firm out of New York." Brianna's face went completely slack, her last hope of salvation evaporating into thin air as she stared at the thick document. "I did not need you to sell her out," I continued softly, watching the final remnants of their arrogant pride wither and die. "I knew about the fake vendor invoices. I knew about the offshore accounts in the Bahamas. I even knew about the exact amount she spent on her last cosmetic procedure. I know Brianna. I commissioned this forensic audit 3 months ago." Preston rattled the heavy door handle one more time, but the magnetic lock held firm. He turned around, pressing his back against the frosted glass, looking like a trapped animal. The arrogant smirk he usually wore had been completely wiped away, leaving behind nothing but a raw, naked fear. He slowly released the handle and walked back to his chair, sinking into the leather with a defeated, heavy sigh. He did not dare look at Brianna, who was still staring blankly at the pile of signed documents that had just stripped her mother of her most prized possessions. Valerie was still weeping, her face buried in her hands. The space on her neck where the heavy diamond necklace used to rest looked strangely empty and vulnerable. The gold watch was gone, leaving a pale indent on her wrist. She had spent her entire adult life constructing an impenetrable armor of designer labels and expensive jewelry, and now she was sitting in a corporate boardroom completely exposed and utterly ruined. Terrence refused to even look in her direction, his own mind furiously calculating how he could possibly survive the financial apocalypse I had just unleashed upon his household. The thick tension in the room was almost a physical weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. They were trapped inside a glass box, waiting for the next blow to fall. They had spent years treating me like an invisible burden, a mistake they desperately wanted to sweep under the rug, and now I was the only person in the room holding all the cards. I opened the front pocket of my briefcase and pulled out a small black velvet pouch. I picked up the diamond tennis necklace and the heavy gold Rolex and dropped them inside, pulling the drawstrings tight. I handed the pouch directly to Mr. Holloway. "Add these to the foundation recovery assets," I instructed the lawyer, my voice calm and professional. "Have them independently appraised and auctioned off by the end of the month. The proceeds are to be immediately allocated to the scholarship fund that Valerie attempted to permanently dissolve." Mr. Holloway took the velvet pouch, nodding respectfully. "Yes, Mom. I will contact our auction house partners this afternoon to expedite the sale." Valerie let out another pathetic whimper as she watched her precious jewelry being bagged up like police evidence, but she did not dare say a single word to stop it. She knew that if she opened her mouth, she would be trading her remaining freedom for a federal indictment. I turned my attention back to the center of the table. The $85 million debt hanging over Elias Commercial Enterprises was still completely unresolved, and Terrence was sweating profusely as he realized his turn was rapidly approaching. He had thrown his wife under the bus to save himself from the wire fraud charges, but he was still the primary guarantor on the massive commercial loans that Apex Holdings now legally owned. He had nowhere left to run, and no one left to blame. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to pull himself together. He cleared his throat, attempting to project a sliver of the aggressive authority he had used to terrorize his employees and his family for decades. Iman, he began, his voice raspy and unsteady. We need to discuss a practical restructuring plan for the commercial debt. Obviously, the current terms are untenable, given the recent revelations regarding the foundation and the personal assets. If Apex Holdings is willing to negotiate a reasonable extension, I can leverage the remaining healthy properties in the portfolio to begin servicing the note. I looked at my father and felt a deep, profound sense of closure. For years, I had craved his approval. I had wanted him to look at me the way he looked at his business partners, with respect and acknowledgement. I had wanted him to see my potential, but looking at him now, I realized how completely hollow he truly was. He was not a titan of industry. He was just a desperate middle-aged man begging his estranged daughter for a financial lifeline because he was too incompetent to manage his own father empire. There will be no restructuring, Terrence, I replied, my words falling like heavy stones in the quiet room. Apex Holdings is calling in the entire $85 million debt effective immediately. You are currently in default on 17 different commercial properties. You have breached every single covenant in the original loan agreements. You do not have the capital to service the debt, and you absolutely do not have the collateral to negotiate an extension. Terrence's face dropped. You cannot do that, he stammered, panic rising in his chest. If you call in the debt, you will force the entire company into immediate bankruptcy. You will liquidate your own grandfather legacy just to prove a point. You will destroy everything he built. I am not destroying his legacy, I corrected him smoothly. I am saving it from you. I pulled another set of documents from my briefcase, placing them precisely in the center of the table. These were not loan agreements or forensic audits. These were official transfer of ownership contracts. Apex Holdings is executing a total asset seizure, I announced, watching the remaining fight drain completely out of my father's eyes. We are taking possession of every single commercial property, every holding company, and every corporate bank account associated with Elias Commercial Enterprises. You are going to sign over your entire controlling stake in the company right now. You are stepping down as the chief executive officer, and you are relinquishing all board voting rights. Terrence stared at the papers, his mouth opening and closing in silent protest. If I sign those, I have nothing left, he whispered, his voice breaking. You are taking my entire livelihood. I will be completely wiped out. You wiped yourself out, Terrence, I said, my tone hard and unforgiving. You spent the last 10 years draining the corporate operating accounts to fund your offshore shell companies and your mistresses. You ignored the failing properties because you were too busy playing golf and pretending to be a billionaire. Granddad built an empire and you treated it like a personal ATM. You do not deserve to hold his name or his assets for one more minute. Terrence looked around the room, searching for anyone who might jump to his defense. But Valerie was still crying into her hands, completely broken and consumed by her own ruin. Brianna was staring blankly at the wall, entirely paralyzed by the loss of her wedding narrative and her husband's sudden unemployment. Preston was trapped by the door, refusing to make eye contact with the father-in-law he now secretly despised. Terrence was completely alone, an emperor without any clothes and without a single loyal subject remaining. I picked up the silver pen that Valerie had used to sign away her mansion and held it out to my father. Sign the transfer documents, Terrence, I demanded. Sign the company over to me, or I will initiate hostile bankruptcy proceedings tomorrow morning. I will freeze every single one of your personal accounts. I will seize your primary residence, and I will drag your name through years of brutal public litigation. You will lose the company either way. The only difference is whether you walk out of this room with the clothes on your back, or if you leave with absolutely nothing at all. Terrence stared at the silver pen for a long, agonizing moment. His hand hovered over the table, his fingers twitching as he weighed his non-existent options. He knew I had him completely cornered. He knew that my legal team at Apex Holdings would shred him to pieces in a courtroom. With a heavy, defeated sigh that seemed to age him 10 years, he reached out and took the pen from my hand. He pulled the transfer documents toward him and began to sign. He did not speak. He did not look up. He just systematically signed away the entire family empire, surrendering his power and his identity to the daughter he had thrown away. As he signed the final page, a soft, rhythmic chime echoed through the boardroom. The digital display panel on the wall next to the door lit up, indicating that someone was requesting entry from the outer hallway. I looked at the glowing panel, and then back to my family, who were all staring at the door in terrified anticipation. They had lost everything: their money, their company, their homes, and their pride. But the execution was not entirely complete. I pressed the button on my phone to disengage the magnetic locks. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open smoothly, revealing the guests I had been waiting for. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open smoothly, revealing the guests I had been waiting for. Two massive uniformed security guards stepped into the room, their broad shoulders completely blocking the only exit. They were not law enforcement, but their imposing presence was the final nail in the coffin for any hope of escape. Preston stared at the guards, and the last shred of his arrogant composure completely shattered. His chest began to heave as he backed away from the doors, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal in a cage. The reality of the situation finally penetrated his thick skull. He was entirely broke. His family firm was liquidated, and the federal government was already building an airtight insider trading case against him. He needed a high-powered defense attorney, and he needed one right now, but his bank accounts were entirely frozen. His luxury cars would be repossessed, and his offshore assets were already flagged. Preston slowly turned his head to look at Brianna. His eyes dropped directly to her left hand, where the massive 5-carat custom diamond engagement ring still sparkled brightly under the recessed lighting. It was a piece of jewelry that had cost over $200,000. It was the ultimate symbol of their elite status, and right now, it was the absolute only liquid asset they had left in the entire world. Brianna saw the desperate, hungry look in his eyes and instinctively clutched her hand tightly to her chest. Preston took a slow step toward her, his breathing heavy and ragged. He held out his hand, his voice shaking with a terrifying manic edge that completely stripped away his refined country club persona. "Give me the ring, Brianna," he demanded, his tone devoid of the smooth charm he usually possessed. "I need to pawn it today to secure a retainer for a federal defense attorney. Apex has taken absolutely everything else. Give it to me right now so I can save my own life." Brianna backed away from him, shaking her head violently. Dark streaks of ruined mascara ran down her cheeks as she backed hard into the heavy wooden credenza behind her. "Absolutely not!" she cried, clutching her hand even tighter against her silk dress. "This is mine. It is the only thing I have left to my name. You are not pawning my ring because you were too arrogant and stupid to hide your insider trading properly. You promised me a life of luxury, Preston, and you ruined it." The insult pushed Preston completely over the edge. The polished Ivy League-educated executive vanished entirely, leaving behind a desperate coward willing to do anything to save himself from federal prison. He lunged at his own wife across the expensive boardroom carpet. Brianna let out a piercing, agonizing shriek as Preston grabbed her left wrist with both hands. He dug his fingers deep into her soft skin, pulling her arm forward with brutal, unforgiving force. He pried at her clenched fist, his face red and contorted with an ugly, selfish rage. "Give the ring to me," he yelled, spittle flying from his lips as he tried to force the heavy diamond over her knuckle. "I am not going to prison for you or your wretched family. Give me the ring." Preston twisted her arm until she cried out in pain. The heavy gold band of the ring dug into her flesh, but she simply curled her fingers inward, refusing to yield. This was the very same woman who had mocked my cheap clothes and laughed when I was left stranded at the airport with $200. Now she was fighting a bloody, desperate battle just to keep a single piece of jewelry while her husband tried to physically rip it off her body. I watched in absolute fascination as the pristine, elegant family I had grown up with was reduced to feral animals, brawling in the middle of a corporate boardroom. Brianna fought back with a vicious, feral intensity. She used her free hand to strike at him, her long manicured nails catching the side of his cheek. She dragged her acrylics deep across his skin, leaving 4 angry, bleeding red scratches down the side of his face. Preston cursed loudly, letting go of her wrist for a split second to grab his bleeding cheek, but he did not back down. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shoving her forcefully against the wall. The sound of her expensive silk dress tearing echoed sharply in the room as they continued to wrestle over a piece of shiny metal. They looked completely pathetic, fighting like starving dogs over table scraps on the floor. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands on the smooth table. It was truly a sight to behold. All my life, they had preached to me about grace, about dignity, about proper breeding. They told me I was unfit for their world because I lacked their inherent class. Yet here they were, tearing at each other. Clothes bleeding on the imported rug, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush. Terrence and Valerie did not even try to stop them. My father just sat in his leather chair, staring blankly at the signed transfer documents that ended his family empire. He was too defeated to even turn his head. My mother sobbed quietly over the loss of her precious jewelry and her impending arrest. She watched her youngest daughter being assaulted by her husband and did absolutely nothing to intervene because her own selfish world had already ended. The elite Atlanta society they had worshipped and sacrificed my future for would be absolutely horrified to see them stripped of their fake elegance and behaving like wild beasts. I did not call off the security guards. I let Preston and Brianna tear each other apart for a few more minutes, watching the ugly reality of their toxic marriage fully expose itself. They had only ever loved the status and the money that came with each other. Without the immense wealth, there was absolutely nothing left between them but bitter resentment and violence. Brianna finally managed to push Preston away, bringing her knee up to strike him in the stomach. Preston stumbled backward, clutching his midsection and wiping the fresh blood from his scratched cheek. His chest heaved with heavy exertion as he glared at his wife. They stood there panting heavily, the silence in the room returning to suffocate them once again as they realized the utter futility of their fight. The ring was not going to save either of them. Then the heavy silence was shattered. Loud authoritative knocks echoed violently through the thick boardroom doors. The sound was completely different from the soft chime of my security team arriving earlier. This knocking was loud, demanding, and official. It was the sound of true consequences finally catching up to a lifetime of greed and crime. Attorney Holloway calmly tapped his pen against his yellow legal pad, adjusted his glasses, and stood up from his chair. He walked smoothly toward the entrance while the 2 security guards stepped aside to let him pass. Holloway reached out and pulled the heavy glass doors open wide to reveal a completely different set of guests standing in the outer hallway. 2 tall men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across the back stood waiting, sternly flanked by 3 uniformed local police officers ready to make their arrests. Valerie let out a feral, high-pitched screech that shattered the heavy silence of the boardroom. The fragile illusion of family loyalty that my parents had preached to me my entire life evaporated in a single heartbeat. All the polished country club elegance, the careful diction, and the perfectly cultivated manners vanished entirely. She lunged across the heavy mahogany table, her manicured hands curled into claws aiming directly for Brianna's face. She knocked over heavy leather chairs and sent silver pens clattering across the floor, driven by a sudden violent need to destroy the daughter who had just sold her out. But before she could reach her target, Preston suddenly moved. Fueled by his own humiliated rage and his utter disgust for the woman who had just insulted him. Preston stepped forcefully in front of his wife. He caught Valerie by the shoulders and shoved her violently backward. Valerie stumbled awkwardly in her expensive designer heels, her arms flailing before she crashed back against the edge of the conference table. "Stay away from her," Valerie Preston shouted, his chest heaving as he stood between his wife and her deranged mother. His face was twisted in a snarl, glad to finally have someone else to blame for his catastrophic downfall. Brianna was trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the table with both hands just to keep herself standing. She looked at her mother with a mixture of absolute terror and cold, calculated survival instinct. She knew the only way out of the $85 million trap I had built was to hand me the one person who deserved to be punished more than she did. "Tell her!" Brianna Valerie screamed, her voice cracking as she leaned against the table fighting to catch her breath. "You ungrateful little brat, after everything I sacrificed for you, after the social standing I built for you. Do not you dare say another word." But Brianna did not look at her mother anymore. She kept her tear-streaked eyes locked entirely on me. Her voice shook at first, but as she kept talking, the words spilled out in a rushed, desperate torrent. "The Elias Family Charitable Foundation?" Brianna blurted out, her words echoing in the vast empty spaces of the room. "Granddad set it up 20 years ago. It was a massive endowment specifically meant to provide full academic scholarships and build community resource centers for underprivileged Black youth across Atlanta. It was supposed to be his ultimate legacy, his way of giving back to the community that supported his early businesses." Brianna took a shaky breath, pointing a trembling finger at our mother. "Mom is the primary executor of the foundation board. She has been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the charity for the past 8 years. She created fake vendor invoices and phantom community outreach programs to siphon the cash directly into her personal offshore accounts. She drained the charity dry, Amon." Terrence turned to look at his wife, his jaw dropping completely open. He had been stealing from the corporate side to fund his string of mistresses, but stealing from a charitable foundation meant for disadvantaged children was a level of depravity even he had not anticipated. The media backlash alone would be enough to destroy the family name forever, to ensure they could never show their faces in polite society again. He stared at Valerie as if she were a total stranger, a monster wearing his wife's skin. "She used the charity money to fund her entire lifestyle." Brianna continued, her voice growing louder and more frantic as she sold her mother out to save herself. The designer handbags she flaunts at the country club, the custom jewelry, the sudden luxury vacations to Paris and Milan. She even used the foundation scholarship funds to pay for her endless cosmetic surgeries in Beverly Hills. She literally stole college educations from poor kids so she could get a facelift and carry a Birkin bag. She has been living a lie funded by stolen charity money. Valerie's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Her perfectly curated high society image, the refined, elegant facade she had used to terrorize me and look down on everyone else in Atlanta, was completely shattered. She was not a pillar of the community. She was a common thief, a parasite who preyed on charity money, meant for children just to feed her own bottomless vanity. She looked wildly around the room, realizing that her darkest secret was out in the open, and there was no way to put the genie back in the bottle. "It is all on that drive," Brianna said, nodding toward the small silver USB stick resting near my hand on the polished wood. "I found her hidden ledgers when I was looking for cash to cover Preston credit card bills. I downloaded everything. Every fake invoice, every offshore transfer routing number, every single receipt from her plastic surgeons. I have all the proof you need, Amon. Just take it and let me go. Let me and Preston walk away from the Apex Holdings debt and the drive is yours. You can send her to federal prison and keep your money. Just let us walk out of this room right now." The room fell dead silent again, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. Terrence was staring at Valerie with absolute disgust. Valerie was staring at Brianna with a look of murderous betrayal. And Brianna was staring at me, waiting for me to accept her desperate plea bargain. They were a family of vipers, and they had finally turned their fangs on each other when the fire got too hot. They were willing to destroy each other completely just to save their own miserable skins. I looked down at the small silver drive resting on the table. It was the ultimate weapon, the key to completely destroying my mother's life and putting her behind bars for decades. All I had to do was pick it up and let my sister walk away, scot-free from the financial ruin she so deeply deserved. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the absolute misery of the moment to settle deep into their bones. I looked at Brianna, desperate pleading eyes, and then I looked at my mother, terrified, shattered face. I did not reach for the USB drive. I did not even twitch a finger toward it. Instead, I calmly reached my hand back into my sleek leather briefcase. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room as I pulled out a thick, professionally bound document sealed in a clear plastic cover. I set it gently onto the table right next to Brianna's bargaining chip. I looked directly into my sister. Panicked eyes, and let a cold, empty smile touch my lips. "I do not need your stolen files, Brianna," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed without a single trace of pity. "I know exactly what she did to the foundation. This document is a fully completed comprehensive forensic audit of the Elias Family Charitable Foundation executed by an independent third-party accounting firm out of New York." The heavy thud of the forensic audit hitting the table finally broke Valerie completely. She stared at the thick bound document as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike her. The arrogant country club matriarch, who had controlled our family with an iron fist for decades, was suddenly reduced to a trembling mess. Her perfect posture collapsed, and her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned a stark white. She knew exactly what that audit contained. She knew it detailed every fake invoice, every phantom community program, and every single dollar she had siphoned away from underprivileged children to fund her endless vanity. "Embezzling from a corporate operating account is bad enough, Valerie," I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the boardroom like a razor. "But embezzling millions from a registered charitable foundation is a massive federal crime. The IRS, the FBI, and the state attorney general tend to frown upon wealthy socialites stealing from disadvantaged youth to buy Birkin bags and fund plastic surgery. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison for the wire fraud alone, and that is before they even begin to look at the tax evasion." Valerie let out a choked, agonizing sob. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. Terrence refused to look at her, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the wall. Brianna was still pressing herself against the credenza, completely horrified by the monster she had just exposed. There was no one left to defend her, no one left to manipulate. "I did not do it alone," Valerie stammered, her voice weak and pathetic. "Terrence knew about it. He helped me set up the offshore routing numbers. You cannot just put this all on me, Iman, please. I am your mother. You cannot send your own mother to prison." "I am not sending you anywhere, Valerie," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms and leaning back in my chair. "The federal government is going to do that entirely on their own. But before they drag you out of your custom-built life in handcuffs, we are going to settle the debt you owe to the foundation. The audit confirms you stole exactly $2 million over the last 8 years. You drained the scholarship funds dry, and you are going to pay back every single cent right now." Valerie blinked her tear-streaked eyes wide with confusion. "I do not have $2 million in liquid cash," she cried. "Terrence cut off my allowance months ago because of the corporate cash flow issues. The offshore accounts are empty. I spent it all. I have absolutely nothing left to give you." "I know you do not have the cash," I said softly, letting a cold, hard smile touch my face. "But you do have hard assets. Your name is the sole entity listed on the deed to the personal Atlanta mansion. Granddad put it in your name for tax purposes 10 years ago. To cover the $2 million you stole from the charity, I am seizing your personal assets, right now." I opened my sleek briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents, sliding them across the table toward her. Attorney Holloway adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, tapping his pen against his yellow legal pad. "These are the transfer of deed documents for the estate. Valerie," I instructed, "you are going to sign the mansion over to the Elias Family Charitable Foundation. The property will be liquidated, and the proceeds will be used to refund the scholarships you stole from those children. Sign it right now, or I will hand this forensic audit directly to the district attorney before the sun goes down." Valerie stared at the papers in absolute horror. Her beloved mansion, the sprawling estate where she hosted her elite society dinners, the physical symbol of her entire identity, was being ripped away from her. She looked at Terrence, begging him silently to intervene, but he just shook his head slowly, looking completely defeated. With a trembling hand, Valerie picked up the heavy silver pen from the table. Tears splashed onto the crisp white paper, blurring the ink as she signed her name, surrendering the only home she had left. When she finished, she pushed the papers back across the table, letting out a long, broken wail. She looked absolutely ruined, but I was not quite finished stripping away her facade. My eyes locked onto the glittering jewelry adorning her skin. We are still a few $100,000 short of the total embezzled amount. Valerie, I stated, my voice entirely devoid of pity. I pointed a finger directly at the massive diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone and the heavy gold Rolex shining on her wrist. Take them off, I ordered. They belong to the charity now. Valerie gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to clutch the diamonds at her throat. What? She whispered, her eyes wide with shock. No, Iman, please. Terrence bought me this necklace for our 20th anniversary. It is a custom piece, you cannot take this from me. Terrence bought you that necklace using money you stole from the foundation. I corrected her, my tone turning sharp and unforgiving. Take them off, Valerie. They do not belong to you. They belong to the charity now. Take them off right this second, or I make the call. The ultimate humiliation washed over her face. The untouchable queen of Atlanta society was being stripped bare in front of her family and the estate lawyer. Her hands shook violently as she reached behind her neck, fumbling with the intricate platinum clasp of the tennis necklace. She let out a humiliating, pathetic sob as the heavy diamonds slipped off her skin. She placed the sparkling necklace onto the dark mahogany table, her fingers lingering on the stones for one last desperate second. Then she unclasped the solid gold Rolex, sliding it off her wrist and placing it next to the diamonds. The jewelry sat there glittering under the boardroom lights, a physical manifestation of her shattered vanity. She buried her face in her hands, weeping openly and loudly, mourning the loss of her superficial armor. She had nothing left to hide behind. She was completely naked to the world, a fraud exposed and broken. While Valerie was busy sobbing over her lost diamonds, I noticed a slight movement near the back of the room. Preston, having realized that his wife had just confessed to massive federal crimes and that his own insider trading operation was completely unprotected, was quietly backing away from the table. His face was pale with absolute terror. He took soft, slow steps toward the frosted glass doors of the boardroom, trying to slip away unnoticed while the rest of the family was distracted by Valerie's breakdown. He reached his hand out, grabbing the heavy metal handle of the door, and pulled. The door did not budge. Preston frowned, pulling harder, but the heavy glass remained firmly shut. He rattled the handle, panic beginning to seep into his movements as he realized he was trapped. I picked up my phone from the table and tapped the screen, locking the electronic magnetic seals on the boardroom doors with a single swipe. The loud click of the locks engaging echoed sharply, cutting through Valerie's pathetic weeping. Preston spun around, his back pressed flat against the glass, his eyes wide with cornered fear. Nobody leaves, I said, my voice perfectly calm and pleasant as I placed my phone back onto the table. You should sit back down and make yourself comfortable, Preston. We have guests arriving. The moment Valerie saw the bold yellow letters on the windbreakers, she let out a blood-curdling shriek. She threw her hands up over her face, backing away from the table as if the federal agents were carrying the plague. Her entire body shook as she braced herself for the absolute worst. No, she sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing off the glass walls. I did not mean to take the charity money. It was a mistake. Please do not arrest me. I will give it all back. But the agents did not even look in her direction. They walked right past my weeping mother, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet, and headed straight for the two men in the room. Valerie slowly lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion as she realized she was not the primary target of this raid. Her charity fraud was a state issue, but the men in the windbreakers were here for federal crimes. Terrence Elias, one of the FBI agents, announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, specifically regarding the illegal siphoning of the college endowment fund. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Terrence went completely rigid. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue a command or a threat, to use the booming voice that had intimidated so many rivals over the years, but no words came out. His entire world was collapsing in real time. The local police officers moved in swiftly, grabbing his arms and pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. At the exact same time, the second FBI agent stepped right up to the glass doors where Preston was still cowering. Preston Vance, you are under arrest for federal insider trading and securities fraud, based on irrefutable evidence provided directly to our office by Apex Holdings. Put your hands behind your back. Preston's knees gave out completely. He sagged against the frosted glass, sobbing like a child as the officers hauled him up and roughly cuffed his hands. He did not look polished or elite anymore. He looked pathetic. The brilliant, arrogant executive who had laughed at my misfortune, who had tried to physically rip a diamond ring off his wife's finger just moments ago, was now weeping openly and begging the officers to loosen the cuffs. He babbled uncontrollably, claiming it was a misunderstanding, claiming he had been framed, but the agents simply ignored him, reading him his rights with cold precision. The agents began to pull the men toward the hallway, but Terrence dug his heels into the carpet, dragging his feet to a halt. He turned his heavy head, looking back at me over his shoulder. The mighty patriarch who had controlled our family with an iron fist, who had banished me because I did not fit his perfect corporate image, was now completely broken. His shoulders were slumped, and tears welled up in his eyes, streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Please, Iman," he begged, his voice cracking with a desperate, pitiful whine that I had never heard from him before. "Please do not do this to me. Pay my bail. You have millions. You own Apex Holdings. You can make this go away. I am your father. Please just help me. I will do whatever you want. Just get me out of this." The boardroom fell dead silent. The air in the room was thick and heavy, suffocating everyone caught within its walls. Even the federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, watching the dynamic unfold. Valerie was frozen against the wall, her mouth hanging open in shock. Brianna was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the sight of her husband and her father in chains, reduced to begging the sister she had spent her entire life tormenting. I did not say a word at first. I simply stood up from my leather chair and smoothed the front of my suit. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute power I held over the people who had tried to destroy me. I reached down and picked up my purse from the floor. I opened the clasp slowly and deliberately, letting the silence stretch out and torture them. I reached inside and pulled out my wallet. My fingers slipped into the cash compartment and extracted 2 crisp $100 bills. I walked around the edge of the conference table, my heels clicking softly against the floor, until I was standing directly in front of where Terrence and Valerie were positioned. I held the money out, keeping it suspended in the air for a long, heavy moment so they could see exactly what it was. Then I opened my fingers and let the bills flutter down. They drifted slowly through the air, landing softly on the dark mahogany table and coming to rest right next to the signed transfer documents that had just ended their empire. "Here is the $200 you gave me at Gate 24 when I was 11 years old," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "Figure it out." Terrence stared at the 2 crisp bills resting on the table and let out a broken, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a man who finally realized that he had dug his own grave and that there was absolutely no one left to pull him out. He had thrown me away like garbage with nothing but $200 to my name, and now that was exactly what I was giving back to him in his darkest hour. The FBI agents did not give him another second to mourn. They yanked him forward by the arms, marching him and a sobbing Preston straight out the double doors and down the long corridor toward the elevators. The sound of their shuffling feet and Preston desperate weeping faded into the distance. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them, leaving a profound, suffocating emptiness in their wake. The grand boardroom that was supposed to be the site of their ultimate corporate victory was now nothing more than their tomb. Valerie and Brianna were left sitting alone in the ruins of their former lives. They had been completely stripped of their immense wealth, their powerful men, and their arrogant pride. They sat there trembling in their torn designer clothes, staring blankly at the table, entirely ruined and entirely alone. They had built their entire existence on vanity and greed, and now they had absolutely nothing left to show for it. I looked down at the women who had made my life a living hell for decades. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel the burning need for vengeance that had kept me awake for so many cold nights. Looking at their hollow, devastated faces, I just felt free. The ghost of my past had finally been laid to rest. "Get out of my building," I told them softly, turning my back and walking away. I did not look back to see them leave. I heard the scrape of wooden chairs being pushed back, the heavy shuffle of defeated footsteps, and the soft, wet sounds of my mother and sister crying as they gathered whatever dignity they had left. The frosted glass doors slid open with a gentle whoosh and then clicked shut behind them, sealing them out of my world forever. The suffocating tension that had filled the boardroom for the last hour finally evaporated, leaving behind a profound, heavy stillness. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking down at the 2 crisp $100 bills I had dropped. The silence in the room was absolute, ringing in my ears like a physical weight. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. For the first time in 22 years, the suffocating grip of my family was completely gone. I was free. I let out a long, slow breath, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. When I opened them, Attorney Holloway was quietly gathering his legal pads and securing the caps on his pens. He moved with the steady professional calm of a man who had just witnessed a hurricane but remained completely untouched by the wind. He did not pack his briefcase to leave. Instead, he stepped away from the table and walked toward the far end of the boardroom, where a seamless wall of dark walnut paneling stretched from the floor to the ceiling. He reached out and pressed his hand firmly against what looked like a solid piece of wood. A soft mechanical click echoed in the quiet room, and a small section of the paneling popped open, revealing a hidden steel wall safe. I watched in silent curiosity as he spun the combination dial with practiced efficiency. The heavy steel door swung open, and Holloway reached inside. He pulled out a thick envelope made of heavy cream-colored parchment paper. It looked old and slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. Holloway closed the safe and walked back toward the table, carrying the envelope with a deep, profound reverence. He stopped a few feet away from me and held it out. "Your grandfather gave this to me 3 days before he passed away," Holloway said, his voice dropping to a soft, respectful murmur. His instructions were absolutely explicit. "I was to place this in the boardroom safe, and I was only to hand it to you after the corporate debt was called in and the family restructuring was entirely complete. He wanted you to read it in the quiet aftermath." I stared at the cream-colored envelope, my throat suddenly tight. My hands trembled slightly as I reached out and took it from the lawyer. The thick paper felt heavy in my palms. Right in the center, written in the sharp, familiar cursive that I had spent my childhood watching, sign important documents and birthday cards, was my name, Iman. I ran my thumb over the ink, feeling a sudden rush of warmth spread through my chest. I broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope and pulled out the folded pages inside. The paper crackled softly in the silent room as I smoothed it out on the table. "My dearest Iman," the letter began. "If you are reading this in the boardroom, then the trap I set has finally sprung shut and you are the only one left standing. I know exactly what happened today. I know what you had to do to Terrence, to Valerie, to your siblings. I know because I engineered every single piece of this massive puzzle to ensure you would be forced to take it all." I had to stop reading for a second, my eyes blurring with sudden hot tears. I blinked them away, pulling in a shaky breath before dropping my gaze back to the page. I always knew who they truly were. Iman, my grandfather wrote his words, cutting through the paper with the same sharp clarity he had in life. I knew Terrence was a weak, greedy fool, who cared more about his country club status than his responsibilities. I knew Valerie was a selfish parasite draining the life out of everything she touched. And I knew exactly how cruelly they treated you. I watched them push you aside, favor your siblings, and treat your brilliant mind like it was a burden. I saw every slight, every insult, and every time they made you feel like you did not belong. You probably wondered why I never stepped in, why I never stopped them or protected you. The truth is, my dearest girl, I was watching you temper into solid steel. I saw the fire in your eyes when they tried to put you down. I saw the relentless grit, the integrity, and the absolute sheer force of will that you used to build yourself up from nothing. You did not need my protection, you needed a kingdom to rule. The $85 million commercial loan was not a mistake. He explained, the ink pressing deeper into the page, as if he was speaking the words directly into my mind. I knew Terrence was mismanaging the funds. I purposely structured the debt covenants so that Apex Holdings would eventually swallow the entire Elias empire whole. I knew Terrence would default, and I knew you would be the one waiting at the end of the road to collect the debt. I gave you the capital to start Apex because I needed to put the family legacy into the only hands strong enough to hold it. The tears spilled over my eyelashes and tracked slowly down my cheeks, splashing silently onto the mahogany table. All these years, I had thought my grandfather was blind to my suffering. I had thought I was fighting completely alone in the dark to prove my worth to a family that did not want me. But he had seen everything. He had known my strength before I even fully recognized it myself. He had not abandoned me to the wolves he had been arming me to lead the pack. They are weak people, Iman. The letter continued. They rely on unearned status and stolen money to pretend they are titans. But you are the true heir. You have my mind, my heart, and my relentless drive. You earned every single ounce of the power you hold today. Do not feel an ounce of pity for stripping them of an empire they did not deserve and could not maintain. You did exactly what had to be done to protect the legacy I built. I touched the final lines of the letter, my heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of validation and absolute peace. The deep, hollow ache of rejection that I had carried in my chest since I was a child finally dissolved, completely washed away by the ink on the page. I was not an outcast. I was the chosen successor. The final words of the letter were written in larger, bolder strokes, pressing hard into the thick parchment paper. They gave you $200. I give you the empire. Make us proud. I carefully folded the pages and slipped them back into the envelope, holding it tightly against my chest. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the boardroom wash over me, wrapping me in a profound sense of comfort. The anger and the bitterness that had fueled my rise to the top were entirely gone, replaced by a solid, unshakable clarity. I wiped the tears from my face and looked up at Holloway, who was watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. "Are we finished here, Mr. Holloway?" I asked, my voice steady and clear, ringing with a new quiet authority. "We are entirely finished," Miss Elias, the lawyer replied, nodding respectfully. "The company is officially yours. Every asset, every holding, every account has been secured under your name. The transition is complete." I looked down at the two crisp $100 bills still resting on the table. They looked so small now, so utterly insignificant compared to the massive corporate empire I had just conquered. I left the money sitting right where it was, a fitting monument to the end of their era and the absolute beginning of mine. I picked up my briefcase and my grandfather letter, turning my back on the empty chairs and the shattered remnants of my family greed. I walked toward the heavy glass doors, my footsteps echoing with absolute certainty. I was no longer the unwanted daughter begging for a seat at their table. I owned the table, the building, and the entire city. I pushed the doors open and walked out to take my rightful place in the world. 6 months later, the view from the top floor of the Elias Commercial Enterprises building looked entirely different to me. I sat behind the massive oak desk that had once belonged to my grandfather, resting my hands on the smooth leather surface. The Atlanta skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows glittering in the bright morning sun. For the first time in a decade, the air in this office did not feel stagnant or suffocating. It felt clean. The transition of power had been swift and utterly ruthless. The moment the transfer documents were verified and the federal agents had cleared the building, I began the absolute total cleansing of my father's toxic legacy. Elias Commercial Enterprises had been operating as a bloated, corrupt boys' club for far too long. Terrence had padded the executive payroll with his golfing buddies, frat brothers, and incompetent cronies who spent more time at the country club than they did managing our properties. I fired every single one of them. I sat in this exact chair day after day, calling them in one by one and handing them their termination papers. They blustered, they threatened to sue, and they demanded severance packages they absolutely did not deserve. I simply pointed to the door and reminded them that my forensic accountants had documented every phantom expense account and every unauthorized company retreat they had charged to the firm. They packed their boxes and scrambled for the elevators in complete silence, knowing they were lucky I was not sending their files to the FBI right along with my father. I also purged the phantom consultants and the so-called public relations specialists who were actually just my father. Various mistresses, collecting six-figure salaries for doing absolutely nothing. The corporate rot ran so deep that by the time my restructuring was complete, the executive floor was practically empty. But I did not mind the quiet. I promoted the hard-working mid-level managers who had been keeping the company afloat while Terrence played billionaire. I elevated the women and the minorities who had been systematically passed over for promotions for years. Within 3 months, the firm was running with a lean, aggressive efficiency that would have made my grandfather incredibly proud. But cleaning up the corporate balance sheets was only half of the mission. The true rot in the Elias family name had been what Valerie had done to the charitable foundation. She had taken money meant to uplift our people and spent it on pure vanity. The betrayal of our community was a stain that I could not simply erase with a corporate restructuring. It had to be scrubbed clean through deliberate, massive action. The liquidation of Valerie estate and the auction of her diamonds and gold watches had fully replenished the stolen $2 million. But I did not stop there. I injected an additional $5 million from the Apex Holdings profits directly into the foundation endowment. I spent the last few months working closely with community leaders, local educators, and city planners to execute my grandfather's original vision. We launched a massive initiative across the most underserved African American neighborhoods in Atlanta. We were not just handing out scholarships anymore, we were building fully staffed community resource centers. These centers provided after-school tutoring access to high-speed internet career counseling and safe spaces for kids who had been completely forgotten by the city. We named the first building after my grandfather, and when I cut the ribbon standing in front of hundreds of grateful families, I finally felt the full weight of my inheritance. I was not just an elite heiress hoarding wealth behind gated communities. I was a custodian of a legacy that actually mattered. The Elias name was no longer synonymous with arrogant excess and country club elitism. It stood for empowerment, integrity, and absolute excellence. A soft knock on the heavy oak door pulled me from my thoughts. Attorney Holloway stepped into the office carrying his familiar yellow legal pad and a slim manila folder. He had become my most trusted advisor over the last 6 months, helping me navigate the endless legal minefields my parents had left behind. He walked across the thick carpet and took a seat in one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," I said, leaning back in my chair and studying his serious expression. "You look like a man carrying heavy news." "Good morning, Miss Elias," he replied, setting the folder down on the desk between us. "I just received the latest updates from the federal prosecutor office downtown. They have officially set the trial schedule, and I thought you would want to be informed immediately." I felt a cold knot of anticipation tighten in my stomach. The legal gears turned slowly, but they ground exceedingly fine. For the last 6 months, Terrence and Preston had been out on restrictive bail, drained of their assets, and living in absolute disgrace while they awaited their fate. Valerie and Brianna had moved into a tiny two-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, entirely stripped of their social standing and their fake friends. They were social pariahs, completely isolated and forced to live the very life they had mocked me for enduring. Holloway opened the folder and smoothed a piece of paper flat. The federal judge has denied every single motion for leniency filed by Preston legal team. He read, his voice calm and professional. Given the sheer volume of evidence regarding the insider trading and his attempt to flee the jurisdiction, the prosecution is seeking a minimum sentence of 12 years in federal lockup without the possibility of early parole. His trial begins the first week of September. I nodded slowly, processing the numbers. 12 years for a man who thought he owned the world. Preston would be nearly 50 by the time he saw the outside of a prison wall. His entire prime, his reputation, his future all completely gone. And my father? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet office. Holloway flipped to the next page and let out a heavy sigh. Terrence's situation is considerably worse, Mrs. Elias. The wire fraud charges, tied to the foundation embezzlement, combined with the corporate loan fraud, have triggered multiple federal mandates. He breached fiduciary duties across state lines and deliberately defrauded a charitable trust. The prosecution is not offering any plea deals. They are making an example of him. His trial is set for the middle of August. How much time is he facing? I asked, keeping my eyes locked on the lawyer. Holloway looked up, meeting my gaze directly. The federal prosecutor is pushing for a 25-year sentence. Given his age and the severity of the financial crimes, it is effectively a life sentence. He will not be walking away from this. I sat perfectly still as the words settled over me. 25 years. Terrence would die in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his tailored suits, his country club memberships, and the family name he had so desperately tried to protect. He had thrown me out into the cold because he thought I was not worthy of his empire, and now that very empire had become the instrument of his absolute destruction. Thank you, Mr. Holloway, I said softly, closing the folder and sliding it to the side of my desk. That will be all for today. The lawyer nodded respectfully and left the room, closing the heavy door behind him. I turned my chair back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city I now completely owned. The sun was rising higher, casting a brilliant golden light across the skyline. I had taken the $200 they threw at me and built a kingdom. I had taken their cruelty and forged an unbreakable armor. They were facing the dark reality of a cold prison cell, and I was finally stepping fully into the light. The stark contrast between my rising empire and the absolute ruins of my family was never more apparent than on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, late in October. While I was finalizing the acquisition of a rival commercial real estate firm, Brianna was standing behind a brightly lit glass counter at a mid-tier department store downtown. Her reality had shifted so violently that she still moved through her days with a look of permanent shock. Preston was gone, locked away in a federal facility, and their massive house had been seized to pay off the mountains of hidden debt he had accumulated. Brianna had been forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to mock during her country club luncheons. The walls of her new apartment were paper-thin, and the constant noise of traffic kept her awake at night, but the nights were nothing compared to the absolute humiliation of her days. Brianna, the former crown jewel of Atlanta elite society, was now working for hourly wages, spraying perfume samples onto small strips of cardboard and offering them to women walking past her makeup counter. Her designer wardrobe had been liquidated to pay for her divorce attorney, leaving her with the stiff black uniform required by the store. Her feet, covered in blisters, ached from the cheap, sensible shoes she was now forced to wear for 8 hours a day. Her manager, a woman 10 years younger than her, constantly reprimanded her for taking too long on her lunch breaks or failing to hit her daily sales targets. She spent every single shift terrified. Her eyes constantly darted toward the escalators, dreading the moment one of her former friends might step off. When a group of women carrying luxury shopping bags walked past, Brianna would instinctively turn her back, pretending to arrange displays of lipstick and foundation, just so they would not recognize the disgraced wife of a convicted felon. The sharp fluorescent lights of the department store highlighted the dark circles under her eyes, making her look hollow and exhausted. She was a ghost in the city she used to rule, completely stripped of the arrogance that had once defined her entire existence. She had mocked my clothes, my ambitions, and my worth for my entire life. And now she was fetching proper shades of concealer for women who did not even bother to look her in the eye. Valerie's descent was even more severe. The majestic, sprawling mansion that had been the center of her social universe was sold to a tech developer, and the proceeds were completely swallowed by the charity reimbursement fund. My mother had been left with absolutely nothing. No house, no offshore accounts, no tennis necklaces, and certainly no friends. The elite circle of women she had once commanded dropped her the very second the news of the charity fraud hit the local papers. They deleted her number, blocked her from their social media, and pretended they had never even heard the name Valerie Elias. To avoid total destitution and pay the rent on the small apartment she now shared with Brianna, Valerie had been forced to find employment. She was 60 years old and had never worked a hard day in her life. The only place willing to hire a disgraced socialite with a pending federal investigation hanging over her family was a high-end salon in the wealthiest district of the city. But they did not hire her to manage the floor or consult on aesthetics. They hired her as the front desk receptionist and general assistant. The ultimate irony was that this was the exact same salon where Valerie used to spend hundreds of dollars a week getting blowout treatments and manicures. Now she was standing behind the sleek marble counter, wearing a plain black dress, answering phones, and booking appointments for the exact same women she used to gossip with. Her hands, once soft and covered in diamonds, were now dry and cracked from washing salon towels and sweeping up hair at the end of the day. It was a daily, relentless torture tailored specifically for a woman whose entire identity was built on pride. When Mrs. Holloway, the wife of the estate lawyer, walked through the glass doors for her weekly styling, Valerie had to force a tight, painful smile. She had to stand there and hold her breath as Mrs. Holloway looked right through her, completely ignoring the fact that they used to share a private table at the country club every Sunday. Valerie had to reach across the counter, take Mrs. Holloway's heavy cashmere coat, and hang it in the closet like a common servant. The other women in the waiting area would whisper loud enough for her to hear, gossiping about the embezzlement and how the mighty had fallen. The humiliation burned her from the inside out, leaving her pale and trembling by the end of every single shift. She had spent her life treating service workers like they were invisible, and now she was experiencing the exact same crushing invisibility every time the salon chimes rang. I knew all of this, of course. I did not have to hire private investigators or track their movements, because the people in my city were more than happy to bring the news directly to my desk. The mighty Elias family falling from grace was the biggest story of the decade, and everyone wanted to make sure I knew exactly where the pieces had landed. But hearing about their misery and seeing it were two entirely different things. I had scheduled a very important meeting with the head of a local community outreach program to discuss the funding for the new neighborhood resource center. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute power and control. I specifically chose a quiet, upscale cafe for our discussion. The coffee was excellent, and the atmosphere was perfect for business. But the main reason I chose this specific cafe was the view. I sat at a small table near the large front window, sipping my espresso and reviewing the financial documents in front of me. The community leader was talking enthusiastically about the positive impact the new center would have on the local youth, but my eyes occasionally drifted out the window toward the street. Right across the wide avenue with its perfectly manicured trees and expensive boutiques was the high-end salon. The large plate glass windows offered a perfectly clear view of the reception desk. From where I sat, I could see Valerie wiping down the marble counter with a rag. Her shoulders were stooped, her posture entirely defeated. I watched as a wealthy client walked in and tossed her wet umbrella directly onto the desk, forcing my mother to scramble to catch it before it ruined the appointment book. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor settle on my tongue. I listened to the community leader detail the hope and the future we were building with the exact charity money Valerie had tried to steal. The balance of the universe had finally been completely restored. The women who had treated me like dirt were now scrubbing it while I sat in the warm sunlight holding the keys to the city. The community leader stood up, pushing his chair back against the polished wooden floor of the cafe. He smiled broadly, thanking me for the unprecedented funding and promising to keep my office updated on the construction timeline. I nodded politely, shaking his hand and watching him walk out into the bright autumn afternoon. I remained at the small marble table for a few minutes longer, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me through the large glass window. I took the last sip of my espresso, setting the delicate porcelain cup down with a soft clink. Across the avenue, the midday rush was in full swing. Luxury cars rolled slowly down the street, and women draped in expensive designer coats hurried between high-end boutiques. It was the exact world my mother used to rule with an iron fist, and now she was just part of the invisible background scenery. Through the large plate glass window of the salon, I watched Valerie turn her head. She was holding a stack of clean white towels, moving toward the back room, when her eyes caught the reflection of the cafe across the street. She stopped dead in her tracks. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment the realization hit her. She dropped the towels onto a nearby chair, completely ignoring the sharp look her young manager shot her from the styling floor. Valerie pushed frantically through the salon glass doors, the heavy chimes ringing wildly as she stumbled out onto the sidewalk. She did not bother to grab a coat to protect herself from the crisp October wind. She was wearing the stiff, unflattering black uniform required by the salon. It was a cheap synthetic material that bunched awkwardly around her waist, and her name was printed on a generic plastic tag pinned to her chest. Her hair, which used to be perfectly coiffed and maintained by the best stylists in Atlanta, was pulled back into a messy, practical knot. My driver pulled the sleek black Maybach up to the curb directly in front of the cafe, the engine purring with a low, powerful hum. I stood up from the table, smoothing the fabric of my charcoal suit, and walked calmly out the door. The cool autumn air hit my face, but it felt refreshing rather than biting. Before I could even reach the rear door of my car, a frantic voice called out, cutting through the noise of the city traffic. "Iman, please wait!" Valerie shouted, her voice cracking as she hurried across the street, dodging a slow-moving taxi. She scrambled up onto the curb, stopping just a few feet away from me. Her chest heaved as she fought to catch her breath, and I could see the deep lines of exhaustion carved into her face. She looked entirely broken. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the Elias family was completely gone, replaced by a desperate aging woman who reeked of cheap salon chemicals in sheer panic. "Iman, please! I am your mother!" she sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out toward my arm, but stopping just short of actually touching me. I have absolutely nothing left. The government took the house. They took all the bank accounts. Brianna and I are living in a horrible little box in a terrible neighborhood. I am working for minimum wage, taking orders from girls who are young enough to be my grandchildren. My feet are bleeding every single night. I cannot survive like this. Aman, please, just a small allowance. Just enough so I can quit this awful job and have some dignity back. You have millions. You have the whole company now. You owe me that much. I gave birth to you." She stood there weeping openly on the busy sidewalk, completely abandoning whatever fragile pride she had managed to hold on to. The tears streamed down her face, ruining the cheap makeup she was now forced to buy. A year ago, the sight of my mother crying might have sparked a twisted sense of satisfaction in my chest. I might have felt a burning surge of vindictive anger or a desperate need to make her hurt even more. But standing there, looking at her pathetic, trembling form, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no rage left. There was no sorrow. There was only a vast, echoing emptiness where my desire for her approval used to be. She was a stranger to me, a ghost begging for a lifeline that I was never going to throw. I let her cry for a long moment, watching as the wealthy women walking past completely ignored her. They clutched their designer handbags tighter, giving her a wide berth, as if failure was something they could catch by standing too close. They looked down at their phones or averted their eyes entirely, refusing to see the ghost of their former country club queen. "You have exactly what you earned, Valerie," I said, my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "You built your entire life on a foundation of stolen money and superficial status. You chased a facade of excellence to impress people who did not even care about you, and you sacrificed your own daughter to do it. You stood by and watched Terrence banish me. You helped him tear me down, and you drained the charity meant for starving children just so you could buy another diamond necklace to wear to the country club." I looked deep into her red-rimmed eyes, making sure she understood that there was no mercy left to exploit. "You threw me out with $200 when I was just a child and told me to figure it out." I continued smoothly, without raising my voice. "Now you are standing here begging for the very wealth you tried to keep me from. I do not owe you a single dime, Valerie. The universe has simply corrected its balance. You wanted to live in a world where only money and status mattered, and now you are experiencing exactly how that world treats people who have neither. This is your reality now. Get used to the uniform because nobody is coming to save you." Valerie let out a choked, agonizing gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as the absolute finality of my words struck her. She knew it was over. The last desperate shred of hope she had clung to, the delusion that her biological tie to me would eventually save her from destitution, was completely destroyed. She sank slightly, slumping against the cold stone facade of the boutique behind her, weeping with a loud, humiliating desperation. I did not look at her again. I simply turned my back on the pathetic scene and nodded to my chauffeur. He pulled open the heavy armored door of the Maybach with a crisp, professional movement. I stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the car, sinking into the soft leather seats. The door clicked shut behind me, instantly cutting off the sound of my mother sobbing on the street. The car smoothly pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flow of expensive downtown traffic. I looked out the tinted window one last time as we drove past. Valerie was left standing completely alone on the cold sidewalk, trapped in her stiff black uniform, while the very women she used to call friends walked right past her, refusing to even acknowledge she existed. The drive back to my penthouse was quiet and peaceful. The image of Valerie standing on the sidewalk faded into the rearview mirror, and for the first time in my life, I felt no lingering guilt or anger. The past was completely severed. That evening, the atmosphere in the private dining room of the Luminary Club was the exact opposite of the cold, sterile environment I had grown up in. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine, and the room was filled with the sound of genuine laughter. We were celebrating the official launch of the Elias Foundation Community Centers and the simultaneous expansion of Apex Holdings across the eastern seaboard. It was a massive milestone, a billion-dollar valuation that completely eclipsed anything my father had ever achieved. I sat at the head of the long oak table, but it did not feel like a throne. It felt like a gathering of equals. To my right sat my partner, a man who had stood by me when I was building my company from a tiny, cramped office. His support was unwavering and completely detached from my net worth. Down the table were my loyal friends, the brilliant women who had offered their couches when I was homeless, and who had helped me review my very first business plans late into the night. Mixed among them were my dedicated colleagues, Attorney Holloway, my chief operations officer, and the hard-working mid-level managers I had promoted when I took over the firm. I looked around the softly lit room, watching these incredible people share stories and celebrate our collective victory. This was true Black excellence. It was not the toxic, fragile illusion my parents had chased for decades. Terrence and Valerie had built their entire identities on country club memberships, designer labels, and stepping on the necks of everyone they deemed beneath them. They had hoarded their wealth to buy their way into elite circles where they were never truly respected, only tolerated because of their bank accounts. They had sacrificed their own daughter just to maintain a perfectly manicured facade. But the success I had built was rooted in concrete reality. We were creating jobs, we were funding education, and we were opening doors for people who had been systematically locked out. The wealth I commanded now was not a weapon to intimidate others, but a tool to build an unbreakable foundation for the future. I had taken the broken pieces of my past and forged an empire of absolute integrity. There were no whispered scandals in this room, no hidden mistresses, no offshore accounts built on stolen charity funds. There was only hard-won truth and mutual respect. As the dessert plates were cleared away and the evening began to wind down, Attorney Holloway stood up and raised his glass to toast our success. The room quieted down as everyone turned to smile at me. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle deep into my bones. The journey had been brutal, pulling me through the darkest parts of human betrayal, but the fire had burned away everything that was fake, leaving only pure gold. I raised my own glass, taking a moment to look at the beautiful chosen family surrounding me. Blood might make you relatives, but it does not make you family. When they left me at that airport, they thought they were getting rid of a burden. They did not know they were forging the architect of their own destruction. The best revenge is not just destroying those who hurt you, it is building a life so magnificent they have to watch you shine from the shadows. The most profound lesson from these journeys is that your true worth is never defined by those who fail to see it, even if they are your own family. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. When toxic relatives underestimate, betray, or abandon you, it can be devastating, but it also serves as the ultimate catalyst for absolute independence. True security comes from building your own success and establishing firm boundaries. You do not have to endure disrespect to keep the peace. Sometimes losing your toxic family is the exact push needed to build a beautiful, authentic life. If you have ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your peace, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your own triumphant story in the comments below.